Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Elijah Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The thing about fear is that it starts small, a whisper at the back of your mind, a shadow glimpsed from the corner of your eye, the feeling of being watched when you know you're alone. That's how it began for me in the Cahoota wilderness of northern Georgia, with small things I could easily dismiss. Until I couldn't. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months. After my divorce was finalized and the custody arrangement for my daughter was settled, I needed to clear my head. My therapist suggested reconnecting with nature might help with my depression. "Find yourself again, Elijah," she'd said. If only she knew what I would find instead. The Cahoota wilderness spans nearly 37,000 acres of the Chattahoochee National Forest, with dense woods, rugged mountains, and pristine streams. I'd chosen a remote 7-day route, following the Jacks River Trail and then veering off onto some lesser-known paths. My plan was to reach Copan Mountain and then loop back around through the Hemp Top Trail. 7 days alone with my thoughts. 7 days to rebuild myself. On my first night, camped near Jacks River Falls, I sat beside my campfire and listened to the rush of water over rocks. The sound was soothing, drowning out the constant chatter in my head, the arguments with my ex-wife, Sarah, replaying on an endless loop, the accusations, the hurt in my daughter Madison's eyes when I moved out. The fall air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. Something rustled in the underbrush beyond my campsite. Probably a raccoon or maybe a deer, I thought, poking at the fire with a stick. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding trees. Another rustle, closer this time. I shined my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly foolish. The wilderness was full of nocturnal creatures. There was no reason to be on edge. But then came a whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it over the falls. "Elijah!" I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. No one knew I was here except my ex-wife, who had my itinerary in case of emergency. I'd specifically chosen this route because it was off-season and I wanted solitude. The rational part of my brain insisted I'd imagined it, the wind in the trees, or the water creating strange acoustics. I settled back down, but added more wood to the fire. Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with whispers just beyond comprehension. Morning brought clarity, and I laughed at my night fears. The Georgia mountains were stunning in the autumn light, leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I broke camp and continued along Jacks River Trail, crossing the river multiple times as the path dictated. The water was cold, numbing my feet even through my hiking boots, but refreshing. By midday, I reached the junction where I would leave the main trail. The path I turned onto was much less maintained, narrow and overgrown in places. According to my map, it would lead me toward Copan Mountain through some of the most remote sections of the wilderness. Perfect. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, only to see the empty trail behind me. The forest was unnaturally quiet, too. No bird song, no scurrying of small animals, just the sound of my boots on the path and my own breathing. "Get it together, Elijah," I muttered to myself. "This is what you wanted, solitude." But solitude shouldn't feel like this, like being watched by 100 hidden eyes. As evening approached, I made camp in a small clearing near a stream that fed into Jacks River. I was efficient with my routine now, tent pitched, sleeping bag unrolled, fire built, dehydrated dinner rehydrating in its pouch. I checked my phone out of habit, though I knew there would be no signal this deep in the wilderness. Dead, as expected. I took out my journal and began to write about the day's hike, trying to focus on the beauty of the landscape rather than my growing unease. As the light faded, the temperature dropped rapidly. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and edged closer to the fire. That's when I noticed the stones. Around the perimeter of my campsite, placed at regular intervals about 6 feet apart, were small stacks of stones. 3 rocks balanced one on top of the other. Trail markers, maybe? But I hadn't noticed them when I set up camp, and they formed too perfect a circle around me to be random. I approached one of the stone stacks cautiously. As I reached out to touch it, a twig snapped loudly in the darkness beyond my campfire's light. I whirled, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's out there?" My voice sounded thin and scared even to my own ears. Silence answered me. Then another whisper closer than before. "Elijah, come, find me." Ice slid down my spine. The voice was female, soft yet somehow wrong, like someone trying to remember how to speak after a long silence. "This isn't funny," I called out, trying to sound authoritative instead of terrified. "If someone's following me, just show yourself." More silence, then a laugh, high and childlike, followed by the sound of running feet, moving away from my camp. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, pushing through underbrush, branches whipping against my face. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure why I was pursuing this. Whatever it was. The sensible thing would be to return to my camp, secure everything, and wait for morning. But something compelled me forward, even as a voice in the back of my mind screamed that this was exactly how horror movies started. The fool running into the dark woods, chasing sounds. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. My flashlight beam bounced erratically as I ran, casting bizarre, shifting shadows. Suddenly, I burst into another clearing and stopped dead. In the center stood a small cabin, weathered gray with age. It shouldn't have been there. There were no structures marked on my trail map for this area. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at me. The door stood slightly ajar. I approached slowly, every nerve screaming danger. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response came from the cabin, but as I drew closer I could see that the door wasn't just ajar. It was being held open as if in invitation. By what? I couldn't see. Reason finally prevailed. I backed away, turned, and tried to retrace my steps to my campsite. But the forest had changed somehow. The path I'd crashed through was gone, or perhaps I'd gotten turned around in my blind chase. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized I wasn't sure which direction my camp lay in. I took a deep breath. I was an experienced hiker. I had my flashlight and my compass. I would find my way back. I consulted my compass, oriented myself, and began walking in what should have been the direction of my camp. After 20 minutes of careful hiking, I emerged into a clearing, the same clearing with the cabin. "No," I whispered, "that's not possible." But there it stood, unchanged except for one detail. The door now stood wide open, and a faint light flickered within, as if from a candle or small fire. My options were limited. Night had fully fallen and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I could try again to find my way back to my camp, but if I failed, I risked hypothermia. The cabin at least offered shelter, and if someone was inside, they might help orient me. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time as I approached the open door. "I'm lost and need some help." The interior of the cabin was a single room, dimly lit by a small fire in a stone hearth. Simple furniture, a table, a chair, a bed in the corner, cast long shadows across the rough wooden floor. But no one was there. I stepped inside cautiously. The fire in the hearth looked recently tended, the flames healthy and bright. Someone had to be nearby. On the table lay a leather-bound book, open to a page filled with handwritten text. Next to it sat a cup of what appeared to be tea, still steaming. "Is anyone here?" I called once more, but the cabin remained silent save for the crackling of the fire. I moved to the table and glanced down at the open book. The handwriting was cramped and archaic-looking, difficult to decipher in the dim light. But one passage caught my eye. "It comes for the wounded souls, those with grief or guilt weighing upon them. It whispers their names and leads them deep into the wilderness. Some say it was once a woman who lost her child in these woods and went mad with grief, becoming something neither living nor dead. The locals call her the Hollow Mother. If you hear her call your name, run. Do not follow. Do not answer." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran through me. I backed away from the table, suddenly desperate to be out of the cabin. As I turned toward the door, it swung shut with a decisive bang. I lunged for it, grabbing the handle and pulling. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, putting all my weight into it. Nothing. "Let me out," I shouted, pounding on the door with my fists. "Why would you want to leave, Elijah?" The voice came from behind me. That same female voice from the woods, but clearer now. "You came looking for me, after all." I turned slowly. A woman stood by the fire, though I was certain she hadn't been there seconds ago. She was tall and thin to the point of emaciation, wearing a tattered dress that might once have been white but was now gray with dirt and age. Her face was partially hidden by long, tangled hair, but what I could see made my blood run cold. Her skin was pallid, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones, and her eyes. Her eyes were solid black, without whites or pupils. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, the movement too fluid, too wrong. "I am Agnes Stillwater. This was my home, many years ago." She gestured around the cabin. "Before they took my son from me." I pressed my back against the door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. "I'm sorry about your son, but I need to go. People are expecting me. My daughter—" At the mention of my daughter, Agnes's expression changed, her face contorting into something hungry and eager. "You have a child? A daughter?" She moved closer, her movements jerky like a poorly operated marionette. "How old?" "8, I answered automatically, then immediately regretted providing any information. "8, Agnes repeated, the word sounding like a caress. "My Timothy was 7 when they took him. Said he had the fever, said he needed to be quarantined." Her voice hardened. "They buried him in unconsecrated ground while I watched from this window. Wouldn't let me hold him one last time." I swallowed hard, trying to think clearly through my terror. That's terrible, Agnes. But it was a long time ago, wasn't it?" 1879, she said matter-of-factly. "Time means little to me now." She drifted closer. "But children still matter. I've been so lonely, Elijah. So very lonely." "How do you know my name?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer from what I'd read in the book. Her lips stretched into what might have been intended as a smile but looked more like a grimace. "I know the names of all who enter my woods with sorrow in their hearts. You carry such guilt, Elijah, such sadness." She was close enough now that I could smell her, a musty, earthy odor like old leaves and grave dirt. I fumbled behind me for the door handle again, pulling futilely. "Your daughter misses you," Agnes whispered. "Madison, such a pretty name. She cries for you at night." Ice flooded my veins. "How do you know her name? How could you possibly know that?" Agnes's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "I know many things about the living. Their sorrows call to me. Madison thinks the divorce was her fault. Did you know that, Elijah? Children always blame themselves." Anger cut through my fear. "Stop it. Don't talk about my daughter." "I could help you," Agnes said, ignoring my outburst. "I could take away your pain. All of it. You wouldn't have to feel this guilt anymore." She raised a hand toward my face. Her fingers were unnaturally long, the nails curved into points. "Just stay with me. Keep me company in these woods." I ducked away from her touch, sidling along the wall. "I need to get back to my daughter. She's waiting for me." Something dark passed over Agnes's face. Rage, or perhaps hunger. No one leaves the Hollow Mother's woods once she's chosen them. Not whole, at least. She lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingers closing around my throat. Her touch was ice cold and burned like frostbite. I struggled, trying to break her grip, but she was impossibly strong. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as she squeezed. "I'll take good care of Madison when she comes looking for her daddy," Agnes hissed, her face inches from mine, breath smelling of rot and decay. Children make such perfect companions, so easy to shape, to change. The mention of Madison gave me a surge of desperate strength. I brought my knee up hard into Agnes's midsection. To my surprise, she released me, more from shock than pain. I think. I didn't waste the opportunity. I grabbed the chair from beside the table and swung it with all my might at the cabin window. The glass shattered outward, and without hesitation I dove through the opening, feeling shards slice into my arms and shoulders. I hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up running. Behind me, Agnes's scream of rage tore through the night, a sound no human throat could make. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no idea which direction I was going. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that cabin, between myself and Agnes Stillwater. Her voice followed me, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You can't leave me, Elijah. No one leaves." I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally had to stop, bent double and gasping for breath, I realized I'd lost my flashlight somewhere along the way. The forest around me was pitch black, the canopy so thick that barely any moonlight penetrated. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of an unnatural silence. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling, no rustling of nocturnal animals, just a heavy, waiting stillness. I fumbled for my phone. Still no signal. But I could use the screen for light at least. The pale blue glow illuminated little beyond my immediate surroundings, but it was better than nothing. I checked my compass, determined to put as much distance between myself and wherever that cabin had been, and began walking again, this time at a steady pace I could maintain. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound, the crack of a twig under my boot, the whisper of leaves in the faint breeze, made me flinch. I kept expecting to see Agnes's gaunt figure materialize from the darkness, those black eyes staring into mine. After what felt like hours of walking, I saw light ahead, the welcome glow of a campfire. Relief flooded through me. Other hikers. Safety in numbers. I quickened my pace, stumbling toward the light. I burst into the clearing and froze. It was my campsite, my tent, my fire still burning as if I'd never left, my pack leaning against a tree where I'd left it. That wasn't possible. I'd run for miles, walked for hours more. Yet there it all was, exactly as I'd left it, including the stone stacks forming a perfect circle around the campsite. I approached cautiously, half expecting Agnes to emerge from my tent. But the camp seemed deserted. My food still hung from a tree branch in its bear-proof container. My journal lay open beside the fire where I'd left it. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed me. Whatever was happening, I needed rest if I was going to face it. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. If I could just make it to dawn, things would be clearer. I would pack up and hike out, return to civilization, return to Madison. I added wood to the fire, building it higher than was strictly necessary. The warmth and light were comforting. I retrieved my first aid kit from my pack and tended to the cuts I'd received breaking through the window. Some were deep enough to need stitches, but butterfly bandages would have to do for now. As I worked, I kept glancing up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, no whispers came. Perhaps whatever Agnes was, ghost, witch, hallucination brought on by isolation, she couldn't approach a fire. That would explain why she'd kept me talking in the cabin instead of simply attacking. Why she'd grown enraged when I'd escaped. I decided to stay awake until dawn, keep the fire burning strong. I pulled out my journal again and began to write down everything that had happened, partly to keep myself awake and partly to preserve a record in case I didn't make it out. The words flowed onto the page, the act of recording bringing some clarity to my thoughts. I wrote about Agnes, about the cabin, about her threats toward Madison. As I wrote her name, Madison, something clicked in my memory. I flipped back through earlier pages of my journal, finding my entry from the day before my trip began. I'd written about my last phone call with Madison, about how she'd told me about school, about her new friend, a girl she'd met in the park near Sarah's new house, a strange girl who played odd games and told scary stories, a girl named Agnes. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I read the entry again, not wanting to believe it, but there it was in my own handwriting. Madison's been talking about her new friend Agnes again. Sarah says she can't find any Agnes in the neighborhood or at Madison's school. Probably an imaginary friend. Madison says Agnes knows me and wants to meet me. I hadn't paid much attention at the time. Children have imaginary friends. It's normal, especially when they're going through stressful situations like their parents' divorce. But now, I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and tried again to find a signal. Nothing. I had to get out of these woods. I had to get to Madison. The sound of a twig snapping nearby made me jerk my head up. At the edge of the firelight stood a small figure, a child of perhaps 7 or 8. A boy in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and solemn. "Hello," I said cautiously, rising to my feet. The boy didn't speak. He raised one hand and beckoned to me, then turned and began walking into the forest. "Wait," I called. "Who are you?" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. His eyes caught the firelight strangely, reflecting it like an animal's. "Timothy," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Mother wants you to come back now." He continued walking, disappearing into the darkness. Timothy, Agnes's son who died in 1879. My mind rebelled against the implication, but I knew with cold certainty that if I followed him, he would lead me back to that cabin. Back to Agnes. But if I stayed here, in this circle of stones... I glanced down at my journal again, at Madison's name written there. Agnes knows me and wants to meet me. He had no good options. If I stayed, dawn might come and reveal this all to be some bizarre hallucination or vivid nightmare. Or Agnes might grow tired of waiting and come for me despite the fire. If I left now, tried to hike out in the dark, I'd likely get lost, or worse, run right into her. And if I did nothing at all, while some entity calling itself Agnes was somehow in contact with my daughter. The decision made itself. I had to get out of these woods, back to civilization, back to Madison. I quickly packed the essentials into my day pack, leaving the tent and other gear behind. Speed would be more important than comfort. I used a stick to pull one of the stone stacks apart, breaking the circle, and waited tensely for some reaction. Nothing happened. Taking a deep breath, I shouldered my pack, gripped my hiking poles tightly, and set off in the direction that should, according to my map and compass, lead me most directly out of the wilderness. Not back along the trails I'd planned to hike, but a more direct route toward the nearest road. The going was rough in the dark, even with my phone's flashlight. I stumbled often on unseen roots and rocks, each time expecting to feel Agnes's cold fingers close around my ankle. But nothing grabbed me. Nothing followed that I could detect. After about an hour of careful progress, the trees began to thin slightly, and the ground sloped downward. I should be nearing the edge of the wilderness area if my navigation was correct. Hope began to build in my chest. Then I heard it, a child's laughter, echoing through the trees ahead of me. Not Timothy this time. This laugh I recognized from countless playground visits and bedtime tickle sessions. Madison. No, I whispered, that's not possible. But there it came again, Madison's distinctive giggle, followed by her voice. Daddy, come find me. Every parental instinct screamed at me to run toward that voice, to find my daughter and protect her. But the rational part of my brain knew it couldn't be her. Madison was safe at home with Sarah, hundreds of miles away. This was another of Agnes's tricks. You're not real, I called out firmly. You're not my daughter. The laughter stopped abruptly. Silence stretched for several long moments. Then a different voice, Agnes's voice, floated through the darkness. Clever man. But it doesn't matter what you believe. The girl is already mine in all the ways that count. Her mind, her dreams. I quickened my pace, pushing through underbrush, no longer trying to be quiet. If Agnes knew where I was, stealth served no purpose. You can't have her, I shouted into the darkness. Madison is protected, loved. Agnes's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. Was Timothy not loved? Love means nothing. The Hollow Mother takes what she wants. Not my daughter, I growled more to myself than to Agnes. Not while I'm alive. That, Agnes's voice came, suddenly right beside my ear, can be arranged. I whirled, swinging my hiking pole like a weapon but connected with nothing. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with malevolence. I ran. No longer caring about direction or obstacles, I crashed through the forest, driven by pure animal fear and the desperate need to get out, to get to Madison. Branches whipped my face. I fell once, hard, scraping my palms and bruising my knee, but I was up again in seconds, running. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, crashing underbrush, the snap of twigs, a high-pitched keening that might have been the wind but sounded too much like a woman's wail of rage. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, the trees ended abruptly and I stumbled out onto asphalt, a road. I'd made it out of the wilderness. A bubble of hysterical laughter rose in my throat. I turned, half expecting to see Agnes emerging from the tree line, those black eyes fixed on me. But the forest edge remained still and silent. No pale figure materialized. No whispers reached my ears. I checked my phone. 1 bar of signal. Not great, but enough. I dialed Sarah's number with trembling fingers. 1 ring, 2, 3. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. Elijah? Sarah's voice thick with sleep. It's 4 in the morning. What's wrong? Madison, I gasped. Is Madison okay? Check on her, right now. What? Elijah, what are you? Please, Sarah, I cut her off, desperation making my voice crack. Just check on her, please. I heard rustling, then the sound of footsteps. A door opening softly. Sarah's voice, distant as she presumably held the phone away from her mouth. She's sleeping, Elijah. She's fine. What's going on? Relief made my knees buckle and I sank down onto the asphalt. Thank God, I whispered. Listen, Sarah, has Madison mentioned her friend Agnes recently? The one you couldn't find at school? A pause. How did you know about that? I only mentioned it to you in passing. It's important. Sarah, has she talked about Agnes? Another pause, longer this time. Yes, more and more often, actually. She says Agnes tells her stories about you, about how you're going to go away and never come back. Sarah's voice had taken on a worried edge. Elijah, what's happening? Where are you? I'm coming home, I said firmly. Right now, don't let Madison out of your sight until I get there. And if she mentions Agnes again, distract her. Change the subject. Don't let her talk about her. You're scaring me, Sarah said quietly. I'm scared too, I admitted. I'll explain everything when I get there. Just keep our daughter safe, okay? After hanging up, I used my phone's GPS to locate exactly where I was, a Forest Service road about 5 miles from the nearest highway. I began walking, thumb out whenever I heard a vehicle approaching. Eventually, a Forest Service truck stopped, and the ranger inside gave me a ride to the ranger station, where I was able to call for a taxi to take me to where I'd left my car. The entire drive back to Sarah's house, I kept expecting to see Agnes's pale face in my rearview mirror, or Timothy standing on the roadside, watching me pass. But the journey was uneventful. By late afternoon, I was pulling into Sarah's driveway. Madison ran out to meet me, flinging herself into my arms with her usual enthusiasm. I held her tightly, breathing in the clean scent of her hair, feeling her solid warmth against me. "I missed you, Daddy," she said, her face buried against my shoulder. "I missed you too, Squirrel," I replied, using my old nickname for her. I set her down and studied her face carefully. She looked normal, bright-eyed, healthy, happy to see me. No sign of influence from whatever Agnes was. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, concern evident in her expression. I gave her a reassuring nod. We would talk later when Madison wasn't listening. "Daddy," Madison said, tugging at my hand. "Do you want to meet my friend?" My blood froze. "What friend, sweetheart?" "Agnes," Madison said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She's here. She followed you home." I looked where Madison was pointing, at empty air beside the porch steps. There was nothing there that I could see, but Madison was waving, smiling at the empty space. "Madison," I said carefully, crouching down to her level, "what does Agnes look like?" Madison gave me an odd look. "You know what she looks like, Daddy. You met her in the woods. She told me." Sarah had come down the steps to join us, her face pale. "Elijah, what is she talking about? What happened in the woods?" I kept my eyes on Madison. "Sweetheart, I want you to go inside and wash up for dinner, okay? I need to talk to Mommy for a minute." Madison pouted but did as she was told, pausing at the door to wave once more at the empty air. "Bye, Agnes. See you later." When she was inside, I turned to Sarah. "We have a problem, a big one. I don't know if you'll believe me, but try me," Sarah said. "Madison's been talking to this Agnes for weeks now. At first I thought it was just an imaginary friend, but..." She shivered despite the warm afternoon. "Sometimes I wake up at night and hear her talking to someone in her room, having full conversations, and sometimes..." She hesitated. "What?" I prompted. "Sometimes I think I hear someone answering her, a woman's voice, but when I check, Madison's alone." I told Sarah everything, about the whispers in the woods, the cabin, Agnes Stillwater, and her threats. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then, "I believe you." I blinked in surprise. "You do?" She nodded slowly. "There's been something wrong about this imaginary friend from the beginning. Madison knows things she shouldn't. Things about our arguments that happened when she wasn't around. Things about your childhood that neither of us ever told her." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. How do you fight something like Agnes? Something that could apparently move between the wilderness and here, that could speak to Madison even when I'd escaped. "We need help," I said finally. "Someone who knows about these things." Sarah nodded. "I have a colleague at the university. She specializes in Appalachian folklore. If this Agnes is some kind of local legend, she might know something." It was a thin hope, but better than nothing. We went inside to check on Madison, finding her happily drawing at the kitchen table. I glanced over her shoulder and felt my stomach lurch. She was drawing a tall, skeletal woman with long dark hair and solid black eyes. Beside the woman stood a small boy in old-fashioned clothes, and off to the side, holding the woman's outstretched hand, was a little girl with pigtails. "Madison." "That's an interesting drawing," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Who are those people? Madison looked up at me with a smile. That's Agnes and Timothy. She pointed to the figures. And that's me. Agnes says I can be her little girl now. Forever and ever. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, saw my own horror reflected in her eyes. Madison, Sarah said gently, why don't you draw something else? How about a puppy or a butterfly? Madison frowned. Agnes doesn't like it when I don't draw her. She gets mad. Well, I said, summoning a cheerfulness I didn't feel, Agnes isn't in charge here. Mommy and Daddy are, and we think you draw Agnes too much. Madison's face darkened in a way I'd never seen before, a look of sullen anger that seemed beyond her 8 years. Agnes says you're just jealous because she loves me more than you do. She says you're going to leave me again, but she never will. That's not true, I said firmly, fighting to keep the fear from my voice. I'm not going anywhere, squirrel. Liar, Madison shouted, the word explosive in the quiet kitchen. Then her eyes widened and she clapped her hands over her mouth. I'm sorry, Daddy, she whispered. I didn't mean it. Agnes made me say it. I pulled her into a hug, exchanging another worried look with Sarah over Madison's head. This was worse than I'd thought. Whatever connection Agnes had formed with Madison, it was strong enough for influence, perhaps even partial control. That night, we made up the guest room for me. Neither Sarah nor I wanted Madison to be alone, but we also didn't want to frighten her by suddenly changing her routine. We compromised by leaving all the doors open and taking shifts staying awake, listening. Around 2 a.m. during my watch, I heard Madison's voice from her bedroom. I moved quietly down the hallway and paused outside her door. She was sitting up in bed, talking animatedly to thin air. But I don't want to, she was saying. That would be mean. Silence, then Madison again. No, I won't do it. You can't make me. More silence, then Madison's voice rose, frightened. Stop it. You're hurting me. I pushed the door open. Madison! She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Daddy, make her stop. She's pinching me. I crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered Madison into my arms. There's no one here, sweetheart. You're safe. She is here, Madison insisted, pointing to the foot of her bed. Right there, and she's angry now because I wouldn't do what she wanted. What did she want you to do? I asked, dreading the answer. Madison buried her face against my chest. She wanted me to hurt you and Mommy while you were sleeping. She said if I did, then I could go live with her and Timothy forever. A sob broke from her. I don't want to live with her. I don't like her anymore. She's mean. I held Madison tighter, rocking her gently. It's okay, squirrel. You did the right thing telling me, and I won't let her hurt you, I promise. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a chill in the room, an oppressive presence. And though I saw nothing, I could almost feel Agnes watching us with those bottomless black eyes, her anger a palpable force. Madison eventually fell back asleep, but I stayed with her, one hand resting protectively on her small shoulder. In the morning, Sarah called her colleague, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who agreed to come over that afternoon. My name is Elijah Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024. The first thing I remember about that night was the sound. Not the screaming, that came later, but the gentle rustling of leaves that shouldn't have been moving in the still air. I'd been camping in the Chattahoochee National Forest for nearly 3 weeks by then, having left behind a marketing job in Atlanta that was slowly killing me one PowerPoint presentation at a time. My therapist called it a necessary recalibration. My ex-wife called it a midlife crisis. I called it survival. I'd chosen the remote northeastern corner of Georgia, specifically the area around Trey Mountain, because it offered what I desperately needed: isolation. The Appalachian Trail runs through parts of it, but I deliberately selected routes that veered away from the well-traveled paths. October in North Georgia meant the leaf peepers would be out in force along the main trails, but the deeper wilderness areas remained largely untouched. My dog Scout, a 4-year-old German Shepherd mix I'd adopted after my divorce, was the only company I needed. She was more reliable than most humans I knew anyway. We'd spent our days hiking through dense forests, alongside hidden waterfalls, and across ridges that offered breathtaking views of the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching toward North Carolina. At night, we'd huddle in my small tent, Scout's warm body pressed against mine as the temperature dropped. The plan had been to spend a full month reconnecting with myself, or finding myself, or whatever cliché you want to use for a man running away from his problems. But what happened on day 21 changed everything. We'd ventured into an area locals called the Hollows, a series of deep ravines and valleys about 7 miles northwest of Helen, Georgia. It wasn't on most tourist maps, which suited me perfectly. An old-timer at a gas station in Cleveland had mentioned it when I'd stopped for supplies. His eyes had narrowed when I'd asked about remote hiking spots. "Hollows is pretty," he'd said, weathered hands tapping on my map. "Pretty and empty. Folks don't go there much since the Radley incident back in '97. When I'd asked about the incident, he'd just shaken his head and muttered something about family business before shuffling away. I should have pressed for details, but at the time, I'd been more interested in the promise of solitude than local gossip. The Hollows lived up to its name. The valleys were deep, shadowed even at midday by towering oak and hickory trees that had likely stood for centuries. Moss-covered rocks and fallen logs created a landscape that felt primeval, untouched by time. The air hung thick and heavy, carrying the rich scent of decomposing leaves and damp earth. Scout loved it. She bounded ahead of me on the faint trail, occasionally returning to check that I was still following. Her tail wagged constantly, ears perked forward in exploration mode. Despite my city upbringing, I'd always felt comfortable in the woods, but something about the Hollows felt different. There was a watchfulness to the silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We made camp in a small clearing beside a creek that cut through the valley floor. Tall ridges rose on either side, creating the unsettling sensation of being at the bottom of a giant's cupped hands. I set up the tent, gathered firewood, and filtered water while Scout investigated our surroundings, nose to the ground. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples visible through gaps in the canopy, I built a small fire and heated a pouch of dehydrated beef stew. Scout settled beside me, head on her paws, eyes reflecting the firelight. The day's hike had been challenging, nearly 12 miles over rough terrain, and my muscles ached pleasantly. This was what I'd come for. Simplicity, physicality, peace. That peace lasted exactly until 2:17 a.m. I know the time precisely because I checked my watch when Scout's growl woke me. She stood rigid at the tent entrance, hackles raised, emitting a low, continuous rumble unlike anything I'd heard from her before. It wasn't her alert bark for wildlife or her warning growl for strangers. This was primal, fearful. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, fumbling for my headlamp. She didn't acknowledge me, focused entirely on something outside the tent. I pulled on my boots and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon providing enough light to see the clearing. Nothing moved. The fire had died to embers hours ago. Then I noticed the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. Just Scout's growl and my own breathing. And that's when I heard it. The rustling. Like someone dragging something heavy through fallen leaves, coming from the ridge to our east. Scout's growl deepened. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Is someone there?" The rustling stopped abruptly. Scout went silent too, which somehow felt worse than her growling. I fumbled with the zipper, opened the tent fully, and stepped outside, headlamp illuminating a narrow path before me. Scout remained frozen in the tent entrance. "Come on, Scout," I urged, but she wouldn't move. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. A deer, maybe a black bear scavenging. But there was something about the deliberate nature of the sound, the way it had stopped at my voice, that suggested intelligence. Human intelligence. I scanned the ridge with my headlamp. The beam caught something, a flash of movement among the trees about 50 yards up. Too quick to identify, but definitely not a deer. It had been pale, almost white. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "I've got a dog here." The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Then came a sound that turns my blood cold even now, remembering it. A laugh, high and feminine but wrong somehow, like a child's laugh played at half speed. It echoed through the hollow, bouncing off the ridge walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Scout finally moved, pressing against my legs, trembling. I knelt and put an arm around her, as much for my comfort as hers. "We're okay," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The laugh came again, closer this time, followed by words that seemed to float on the night air. Elijah. My name. My fucking name, which I hadn't given to anyone within 100 miles of here. Fear crystallized in my chest. I backed toward the tent, dragging Scout with me. My headlamp beam bounced wildly across the trees, catching nothing. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. "You shouldn't be here, Elijah Mercer," came the voice again. A woman's voice, but distorted as if speaking through water. "This place isn't for the living." Ice shot down my spine. I lunged for the tent, grabbing my backpack where I kept bear spray and a hunting knife. Neither seemed adequate for whatever was happening, but they were better than nothing. When I emerged again, knife in one hand and bear spray in the other, Scout at my heels, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind the trunk of a massive oak. In the moonlight, she appeared to be a woman in her 30s, wearing what looked like a simple white dress. Her hair hung long and dark around a face I couldn't quite make out. She was utterly still, watching me. "Who are you?" I called. "How do you know my name?" She stepped forward into a shaft of moonlight, and I saw her clearly for the first time. My breath caught in my throat. Her dress wasn't white, it was soaked in blood, dark stains spreading across the fabric. Her face, beautiful in a severe way, was unnaturally pale except for dark hollows around her eyes. But what struck me most was how she seemed to flicker, like a bad television signal, momentarily transparent before solidifying again. "I am Margaret Radley," she said, her voice suddenly clear and normal. Or I was. The name connected immediately to what the old man had said. The Radley incident. 1997. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Company. It gets lonely here in the hollows." She took another step forward. Scout backed up, whimpering. I raised the bear spray. "Stay back," I warned. "Or what, Elijah?" Another step. "You'll hurt me?" Her laugh bubbled up again, the terrible wrong sound. "I'm already dead." My mind raced. Ghost, hallucination, psychotic local. Whatever she was, I needed to get away. The tent and most of my supplies were behind me, but my car was miles away, back at a small trailhead parking area. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I'll go." "No one leaves the hollows after dark," she said matter-of-factly. "Surely you know that. It's why they warned you away." But they hadn't warned me away. Not really. The old man had hinted, but I'd ignored it, too focused on finding my solitude. Margaret Radley took another step forward and another. She moved oddly, her feet not quite touching the ground. I backed up, Scout pressed against my legs. "What happened to you?" I asked, playing for time as I tried to think of a way out. Her expression changed, becoming mournful. "My husband. He brought me here for our anniversary, 27 years ago." She glanced around the clearing. Right here, in fact. Your tent is where ours was. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October night. He was jealous, she continued conversationally. Thought I was having an affair with his brother. I wasn't, but David never could trust anyone. Her hand went to her throat where I now noticed a dark line. He held me under the creek water until I stopped fighting. She was closer now, close enough that I could see water dripping from her dress. Her hair, forming small puddles that vanished into the ground. And now I find others, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Others who come alone. They keep me company, forever. Scout suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously. I grabbed for her collar but missed. She charged Margaret, teeth bared, and passed right through her. Scout skidded to a stop, confused, then turned and ran back to me, tail between her legs. Margaret flickered again, her image becoming wispy before reforming. The smile never left her face. Animals know, she said. They've always known what I am. Whatever rational explanations I'd been considering evaporated. I was looking at something impossible, something that shouldn't exist outside of horror movies and campfire stories. The others, I said, my voice barely audible. The others you found. Where are they? She gestured toward the creek. Below, with me, waiting for you. The creek? Jesus Christ. I remembered how dark and deep some of the pools had looked when we'd arrived, how the water had seemed unnaturally still in places. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said, finding my voice again. They all say that. She sighed, the sound like wind through dead leaves. The fighting makes it worse. David taught me that. She moved faster than seemed possible, suddenly directly in front of me. Up close, her face was a horror, beautiful but wrong, like something trying to remember how to be human. Water streamed from her hair, her eyes, her mouth. I stumbled backward, tripping over Scout, and fell hard. The bear spray flew from my hand, disappearing into the underbrush. I still had the knife, but what good was steel against whatever she was? Margaret loomed over me, water dripping onto my face. It was ice cold and smelled of rot. Join us, Elijah, she whispered. The water isn't so bad once you stop breathing. Her hands reached for my throat. I scrambled backward, but she followed effortlessly, floating above the ground. Scout barked frantically, trying to bite her again and again, each time passing through her form like smoke. My back hit a tree. Nowhere left to go. Her hands, corpse cold and somehow solid despite her ghostly appearance, closed around my neck. I slashed with the knife, cutting through her arm and meeting no resistance. The blade passed through, leaving her form momentarily disturbed before it reformed. That won't help you, she said almost kindly. The pressure on my throat increased. I couldn't breathe. Black spots appeared at the edges of my vision. Scout's barking seemed to come from far away. In desperation, I lunged forward through her. It felt like plunging into freezing water, a cold so intense it burned. But I was past her, gasping for air. "Scout, come!" I yelled, staggering to my feet. She was there instantly, pressing against my side. I didn't look back, just ran. Away from the clearing, away from the tent and supplies, away from Margaret Radley. I had my knife, my phone, and my dog. Everything else could stay behind. I splashed across the creek, the water shockingly cold against my shins. On the other side, I paused to look back. Margaret stood at the water's edge watching me. She didn't try to cross. "You can't run forever, Elijah," she called, her voice carrying easily across the water. "The hollows go on for miles, and I'm not the only one here." That last sentence sent fresh fear through me. Not the only one. How many others like her were there? How many victims? I turned and continued running, using my phone's flashlight to avoid roots and holes that could twist an ankle. Scout stayed close, occasionally whining but keeping pace. I had no plan beyond putting distance between us and Margaret Radley's ghost. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I stopped, lungs burning. We'd been climbing steadily, moving up the ridge and away from the creek. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected, but the GPS still worked. We were heading roughly northeast, away from where I'd parked but toward the town of Helen. If we could make it there, we'd be safe. Or at least among other living people. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of the forest around us again. The unnatural silence from earlier was gone, replaced by normal night sounds. Insects, the occasional rustle of small animals. Whatever zone of wrongness surrounded Margaret Radley, we seemed to be outside it now. "We're okay. Scout," I murmured, scratching behind her ears. "We're going to be fine." She looked up at me, trust in her eyes despite the terror we'd just experienced. I checked the time, almost 3:30 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, but I had no intention of stopping before then. We continued moving, more slowly now but steadily, following game trails when possible and pushing through underbrush when necessary. My phone's GPS showed us making progress toward Helen, though it would still be miles before we reached anything resembling civilization. Around 4:15 a.m., Scout froze, ears forward, staring into the darkness ahead. I stopped immediately, trusting her senses more than my own. The hairs on my arms rose as the forest fell silent once more. "What is it, girl?" I whispered. A twig snapped, perhaps 30 yards ahead. Scout growled, low and threatening. I raised my phone, the flashlight beam penetrating only a short distance into the gloom. "Hello?" I called, immediately cursing myself for making the same mistake twice. "Margaret?" No answer came, but something moved in the darkness, a shadow shifting against the greater darkness of the forest. I took a step backward, ready to run again if necessary. Then a voice called out, male this time, rough with age or disuse. "You running from her too?" Relief flooded through me at the sound of another human voice, one that seemed normal, not distorted like Margaret's had been. "Yes," I answered. "Who are you?" A figure emerged slowly into the edge of my light beam. An old man, perhaps in his 70s, with a wild gray beard and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He carried a walking stick and had a small pack over one shoulder. "Name's Earl Pierce," he said, keeping his distance. "Been living in these woods going on 15 years now." Scout continued to growl, which gave me pause. She was usually good with people. "My dog doesn't seem to like you," I said, not moving closer. Earl chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves rubbing together. "Smart animal. She knows I ain't exactly what I appear to be." He tapped his walking stick against the ground. "But I ain't like Margaret neither. I'm still breathing, for one thing." "You know her?" "Know of her. Everyone who stays in the hollows long enough learns about Margaret Radley." He gestured for me to follow him. "Come on, got a shelter not far from here. Safer than standing in the open." I hesitated. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," he said simply, "but I've been surviving her and the others for a long time. Your choice if you want my help or not." The way he said "the others" sent another chill through me. Margaret had used the same phrase. "What others?" I asked. Earl looked at me like I was dense. "The dead ones. The ones who didn't leave when they should have." He peered into the darkness behind me. "They'll be coming soon. Margaret doesn't like to lose what she considers hers." As if on cue, that terrible laugh echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable. Scout pressed against my leg, trembling. "All right," I decided quickly. "Lead the way." Earl nodded and turned, moving with surprising agility for his age. I followed, keeping my light trained on the path ahead. Scout stayed close, still wary but seeming to recognize the necessity of following this strange old man. We hiked for about 10 minutes, steadily climbing, until Earl led us to what appeared to be a small cave entrance partially hidden by hanging vines. He pushed these aside and gestured for me to enter. "Home sweet home," he muttered. I paused again, shining my light into the opening. It revealed a surprisingly well-established shelter, a small cavern, perhaps 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a dirt floor covered in woven grass mats. Along one wall were shelves carved into the rock, holding jars, tools, and other supplies. A small fire pit sat in the center, currently cold but well used. "You live here?" I asked, impressed despite myself. "Going on 9 years in this particular spot," Earl confirmed, following me inside. "Had another place before, closer to the creek, but it got compromised." The way he said the last word made me think there was more to that story, but I didn't press. He busied himself starting a small fire in the pit, using dry wood stacked neatly nearby. Soon, a warm glow filled the cave, pushing back the darkness. In the firelight, I could see Earl more clearly. His face was deeply lined, his eyes sunken but alert. His clothes, though worn, were clean and well-maintained. He moved with purpose, like someone who had established routines and stuck to them religiously. "So," he said once the fire was going steadily, "you met our Margaret. Not many survived that first encounter." He said it so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the implication to sink in. "How many people has she killed?" I asked, the horror of the situation fully dawning on me. Earl shrugged. "Hard to say exactly. Been happening since '97 when her husband did her in. 1, maybe 2 folks a year. Hikers mostly, sometimes hunters. People who wander off the main trails looking for solitude." He gave me a pointed look. "People like you." The accusation in his tone was unmistakable. "I didn't know," I defended myself. "Some guy at a gas station mentioned the hollows, but he didn't warn me about this." "Locals don't talk about it much," Earl said. "Bad for tourism. They just quietly stopped maintaining the trails out this way. Took it off the maps. Figure what folks don't know won't hurt them." He poked at the fire. "Except sometimes it does." "But how is this possible?" I asked, struggling to reconcile what I'd seen with my understanding of reality. "Ghosts aren't real." Earl gave me a long look. "You just saw one try to drown you. Son, I'd say your definition of real needs adjusting." He had a point. I sat down on one of the mats, Scout settling beside me, eyes fixed on the cave entrance. "So, what's your story?" I asked. "Why are you living out here knowing what's in these woods?" Earl was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice had softened. "My daughter came hiking out here in 2006, never came back." His eyes lifted to meet mine. "Official story was she got lost, died of exposure. But I knew better. I'd heard the rumors about the hollows, about hikers going missing. So I came looking." He gestured around the cave. "Been here ever since." "Looking for your daughter?" I asked gently. "Found her," he said, his voice hollow. "Or what's left of her. She's with the others now in the creek. Sometimes I hear her voice on bad nights." He looked back at the fire. "But it ain't really her anymore. Just like that thing you met ain't really Margaret Radley." "Then what is it?" Earl shrugged again. "Something old. Something that was here long before white folks settled these mountains. The Cherokee had stories about these hollows, about spirits that could take the shape of the recently dead. They avoided this place." He poked at the fire again. "Margaret was just its most recent face. Before her, it was probably someone else." The implications were terrifying. Not just one vengeful ghost, but something older, something that used the dead as puppets. "How have you survived this long?" I asked. Earl reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch on a cord around his neck. "Protection," he said simply. "Learned it from an old Cherokee man years back. Keeps them at a distance, mostly." He nodded toward the cave entrance. "They can't come in here either. Sacred ground or something like it." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't in a position to be skeptical. "And the others you mentioned? The other ghosts?" "They're out there," Earl confirmed. Most stay near where they died. The creek for Margaret and her victims. The old logging camp up north for the men who died in the accident back in the 50s. The ridge where that family was murdered in the 70s. He shook his head. But they're all just faces it wears. The thing beneath, the real thing, it's everywhere in the hollows. We fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and Scout's occasional whine. I checked my phone again. Still no signal, and the battery was down to 62%. I switched it to power-saving mode. "So, what's the plan?" I finally asked. "I need to get out of here, back to my car or to Helen." Earl nodded. "Dawn's in a couple hours. They're weaker in daylight. Not gone, but weaker. We'll head out once the sun's up." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bag, offering it to me. "Jerky. You should eat something." The dried meat was tough but flavorful. Scout perked up at the smell, and I gave her a piece which she devoured eagerly. "Thank you," I said, realizing how hungry I was. "For everything." Earl waved it away. "Been a while since I had company that wasn't trying to drown me." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Your dog seems like good people." Scout, sensing she was being discussed, thumped her tail once against the floor. We ate in companionable silence for a while. Despite the circumstances, I felt oddly safe in this strange man's cave. Perhaps it was just the relief of not being alone in the face of something inexplicable and terrifying. "You said they're weaker in daylight," I said eventually. "Why not just leave? Why stay in the hollows all these years?" Earl's face darkened. "Told you, my daughter's here." He stared into the fire. "And someone needs to warn folks who wander in when I can. Save who I can." I considered this. "How many have you saved?" "Not enough," he said quietly. "Maybe a dozen over the years. Hard to track time out here sometimes." "And the others, the ones you couldn't save?" He didn't answer directly. "The thing about the hollows," he said instead, "is that it doesn't just take your life. It takes your death, too. Binds you here?" He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's why I can't leave. Not while my Emily's still trapped." I wanted to ask how he planned to free her, but something in his expression stopped me. This was a man who had been fighting a battle for 15 years with no end in sight. A man driven by love and guilt in equal measure. "Get some rest if you can," Earl said, changing the subject. "I'll keep watch. Dawn's not far off." Though I doubted I could sleep after everything that had happened, exhaustion soon overtook me. With Scout pressed warm against my side and the fire crackling softly, I drifted into an uneasy slumber. I dreamed of water, cold, dark water closing over my head, filling my lungs. And faces, so many faces, watching from the depths, their eyes empty, their mouths opened in silent screams. Among them was a young woman who looked strikingly like Earl, her features softer but with the same determined set to her jaw. She reached for me, her movements slow in the water, her lips forming words I couldn't understand. I woke with a start, gasping for breath. Earl was still by the fire, whittling something from a piece of wood. Daylight filtered through the cave entrance, suggesting I'd been asleep for at least a couple of hours. "Bad dreams?" Earl asked without looking up. I nodded, still shaken. "I saw her. Your daughter." His hands stilled. "You couldn't have. You don't know what she looks like. About my age, your eyes, your jaw, dark hair cut short." I swallowed hard. She was trying to tell me something. Earl's face paled. He set down his whittling and the small knife he'd been using. "That's Emily," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "What did she say?" I couldn't tell. We were underwater. I rubbed my face, trying to clear the lingering sensation of drowning. It was just a dream. "No such thing as just a dream in the hollows," Earl said grimly. "The dead speak through them sometimes." He stood, suddenly businesslike. "Time to go. Sun's been up almost an hour." I checked my phone, 7:24 a.m. The battery was down to 51%. At least the GPS still worked. Helen's closest, I said, showing him the map. Maybe 4 miles northeast of here. Earl studied it, then shook his head. Can't go that way. Have to cross the creek again, and that's her territory. Margaret's strongest there. Then what do you suggest? We head west, toward the logging road. It's longer to civilization, maybe 7 miles to the highway, but safer. He began gathering a few items, stuffing them into his pack. Once you hit the highway, you can hitch a ride to Helen, then figure out how to get back to your car. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't about to argue with the man who'd survived in these woods for 15 years. What about you? I asked. Will you come too? Earl shook his head. Told you, I can't leave. But no point arguing, he cut me off. Just the way it is. He handed me a small leather pouch similar to the one he wore. Take this. Might help if you run into trouble before you're clear of the hollows. I accepted it, feeling the odd, lumpy contents within. What's in it? Better you don't know, he said with a hint of a smile. Just keep it on you until you're well clear of these woods. We left the cave shortly after, Scout leading the way, seemingly refreshed after her rest. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing but no less ancient. Mist clung to the ground in patches, swirling around our feet as we walked. Earl moved with confidence, clearly familiar with every rise and fall of the terrain. He kept us on game trails when possible, avoiding thicker brush that would slow our progress. We spoke little, saving our breath for the hike. Around mid-morning, we stopped by a small spring to refill our water bottles. As Earl knelt by the water, I took the opportunity to ask a question that had been nagging at me. Last night, you said you weren't exactly what you appeared to be. What did you mean by that? Earl glanced up at me, then back at the water. 15 years in these woods changes a man, he said cryptically. You spend enough time around the dead, you start to understand them. Maybe become a little like them. Are you saying you're... I'm saying lines get blurry out here, he interrupted. Life, death, past, present, real, unreal. He stood, capping his water bottle. I've been in the hollows too long. Part of me belongs to it now, just like part of it belongs to me. Before I could press for a clearer answer, Scout's head snapped up, her attention fixed on something to our east. A low growl rumbled in her chest. Earl noticed too. We need to move, he said urgently. Now. What is it? Margaret. She's found us. Fear shot through me. I thought you said they were weaker in daylight. Weaker, not gone. Earl reminded me, already moving west again at a quicker pace. And she's persistent when she's got the scent of someone, especially someone who got away. We hurried through the forest, no longer concerned with conserving energy. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see Margaret's ghostly form emerging from the trees, but there was nothing visible. Still, Scout's continued unease told me all I needed to know. Something was following us. The terrain grew steeper as we climbed toward a ridge that Earl said would lead us to the logging road. The physical exertion helped keep the fear at bay, focusing my mind on the immediate challenge of the climb rather than what might be pursuing us. We were perhaps halfway up the ridge when Scout suddenly stopped, turning to face the way we'd come. Her growl deepened, hackles raised. Earl and I stopped too, watching the forest below. At first, I saw nothing. Then, movement, a figure picking its way through the trees, following our path exactly. Even at this distance, I recognized Margaret's white dress, now appearing dry in the daylight but still stained with dark patches. She's never followed this far before, Earl muttered, concern evident in his voice. What do we do? He considered for a moment. Keep climbing. The ridge line is less than half a mile ahead. She doesn't usually cross ridge lines. Acts as a kind of boundary. We continued upward, moving as quickly as the steep terrain allowed. Scout stayed between us now, occasionally looking back and growling. I could feel the protective pouch Earl had given me thumping against my chest with each step, and I hoped whatever was inside truly offered some protection. When we reached the top of the ridge, I turned to look back again. Margaret had gained ground, now clearly visible perhaps 200 yards behind us. In daylight, she looked more solid, less obviously supernatural, just a woman in a blood-stained dress, her dark hair hiding much of her face. But the way she moved, gliding over obstacles that should have slowed her, betrayed her inhuman nature. "Don't stop," Earl urged, pulling at my arm. "Need to put the ridgeline between us." We started down the other side, the descent almost more difficult than the climb had been. Loose rock slid under our boots, threatening to send us tumbling. Scout managed better than either of us, her 4 legs providing better stability on the treacherous slope. About halfway down, Earl's foot caught on a root, and he fell heavily, crying out in pain. I rushed to his side. "My ankle," he gasped, clutching at his lower leg. "Twisted it good." I helped him into a sitting position and examined the injury. The ankle was already swelling, likely a bad sprain if not a fracture. "Can you walk?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. Earl grimaced. "Not quickly, not the way we need to." He looked back up the ridge. "She'll be over that rise any minute." As if on cue, Margaret appeared at the top of the ridge. She paused there, watching us, her head tilted curiously like a predator considering its prey. "Leave me," Earl said suddenly. "Earl, take the dog and go. The logging road is less than 2 miles that way." He pointed west. "Follow it south until you hit the highway." "I'm not leaving you," I protested. Earl gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Yes, you are. I've lasted 15 years out here, I'll be fine." He pushed me away, pushed me. "Go. Now." Margaret had started down the ridge, moving with unnatural grace over terrain that would challenge even an experienced hiker. "Listen to me," Earl said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The pouch I gave you. It'll keep you safe if you make it past the logging road. That's the outer boundary of her territory." "But what about you?" I insisted. Earl smiled grimly. "Me and Margaret, we've got an understanding of sorts. Been playing this game a long time." He pulled something from his pocket, a small curved knife with strange symbols carved into the handle. "Besides, I'm not as defenseless as I look." I hesitated, torn between helping this strange man who'd saved my life and saving myself. Scout made the decision for me, tugging at my sleeve with her teeth, pulling me away from Earl. "Smart dog," Earl said. "Now go, and whatever you hear, don't look back." With a final nod of gratitude, I turned and ran, Scout bounding ahead. The forest blurred around us as we fled downhill, my lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. Behind us, I heard Earl's voice rise in what sounded like a chant or prayer, words I couldn't understand carried on the morning air. Then came Margaret's scream, high and furious, not human at all, a sound that sent birds exploding from the trees around us. My instinct was to look back, but I remembered Earl's warning and kept my eyes forward, focused on following Scout through the underbrush. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Eventually, the slope leveled out, and we found ourselves on a rutted dirt track overgrown with weeds, the logging road Earl had mentioned. I stopped, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. Scout circled back to me, panting but alert, her eyes fixed on the way we'd come. No sound of pursuit reached us. No screams, no rustling, nothing but normal forest noises. I wanted to believe that meant Earl had somehow driven Margaret away, but a hollow feeling in my gut suggested otherwise. The protective pouch still hung around my neck. I clutched it, silently thanking Earl for his sacrifice, promising myself I'd come back with help once I reached civilization. We followed the logging road south as Earl had instructed. It was slow going. Fallen trees and erosion had made parts of it nearly impassable, but it was still easier than pushing through the forest. My phone battery had dropped to 38%, so I used the GPS sparingly, just enough to confirm we were still heading toward the highway. Around noon, Scout suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward. I froze too, scanning the forest around us. Nothing seemed immediately threatening, but I'd learned to trust her instincts. "What is it, girl?" I whispered. She wasn't growling as she had with Margaret, just alert and watchful. Then I heard it. Voices, human voices, carrying through the trees ahead of us. Relief flooded through me. Other people meant safety, meant an end to this nightmare. I hurried forward, Scout reluctantly following. The logging road curved around a stand of ancient oaks, and beyond them opened into a small clearing. In the center stood two men beside an old pickup truck, engaged in what appeared to be an argument. They fell silent as I emerged from the trees. They were an odd pair, one tall and rail-thin with a patchy beard, the other stocky and completely bald. Both wore hunting camouflage and had rifles slung over their shoulders. The truck was mud-splattered and rusty with Georgia plates. "Hello," I called, raising a hand in greeting. "Thank God. I've been lost out here since last night." The men exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. The taller one stepped forward. "You all right, buddy? You look like you've been through hell." His accent was pure North Georgia mountains, thick as molasses. "I'm fine now," I said, approaching them. Scout stayed at my heels, unnaturally quiet. "My campsite was up in the hollows. Had to leave in a hurry last night." At the mention of the hollows, something changed in their expressions. The bald man's eyes narrowed. "The hollows, huh?" he said. "Not many folks go there these days." "Yeah, I found out why," I replied with a nervous laugh. "Listen, I need to get to town. My car's back at a trailhead near Trey Mountain, but I can figure that out later. Can you give me a ride to the highway?" Another exchanged glance between them. Then the tall one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure thing. We're heading that way ourselves. Hop in the back." He gestured to the truck's open bed. "Dog, too." Relief washed over me again. "Thank you. Seriously." As I moved toward the truck, Scout suddenly planted herself in front of me, blocking my path. A low growl rumbled in her chest, the same warning she'd given before Margaret appeared. I hesitated, suddenly uneasy. Something was wrong. Why hadn't I questioned what these men were doing out here, miles from anywhere, on an abandoned logging road? The tall man's smile faded. "Problem with your dog?" I looked more closely at them, at their clothes, at their truck. Their camouflage was worn but clean. No mud, no signs they'd been hiking or hunting. No deer tags on the truck, no visible hunting gear besides the rifles, and the rifles themselves. Not hunting rifles, but tactical, military-style weapons. "She's just nervous," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Been a rough night." I reached down to pat Scout, whispering, "Easy, girl." "The hollows got a way of making folks jumpy," the bald man said, his hand casually moving to rest on his rifle. "You see anything strange up there?" The question was too pointed, too knowing. These men weren't random hunters. They knew something about the hollows, about Margaret. "Just got spooked by some wildlife," I lied. "Thought I'd head back to civilization a bit early." The tall man snorted. "Wildlife, right." He stepped closer. "Listen, friend, why don't you tell us what you really saw up there? We're interested in the stories." Every instinct told me to run, but they had rifles, and we were still miles from the highway. I needed to play along, at least temporarily. "Just shadows," I said with a shrug. "Thought I heard voices. Probably just the wind." "Voices," the bald man repeated, nodding as if I'd confirmed something. "Like a woman's voice, maybe?" Ice formed in my stomach. They knew about Margaret, but how? And why were they so interested? "Maybe," I admitted cautiously. "Why?" The tall man grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Because we've been hunting that ghost bitch for years, and you're the first person we've met who's seen her and lived to talk about it. Ghost hunters." But something in their demeanor, in the casual way they held their weapons, suggested they were more dangerous than the typical paranormal enthusiasts. I didn't say I saw a ghost, I protested weakly. Didn't have to, the bald man said. It's written all over your face. He stepped forward. Name's Harlan Dobbs. This here's my brother Curtis. Our family's been in these mountains for 8 generations. The hollows are our special interest, you might say. Family business, Curtis added with a chuckle, echoing what the old man at the gas station had said about the Radley incident. A terrible suspicion formed in my mind. Radley, I said slowly. Any relation to David Radley? Their expressions darkened simultaneously. Our cousin, Harlan confirmed. Man got a raw deal. Everyone thinking he killed his wife when she just ran off with his brother. Except she didn't, I said, unable to stop myself. She's still in the hollows. I saw her. Curtis spat on the ground. That ain't Margaret Radley. That's something else wearing her face. Something that's been in these woods a lot longer than any Radley or Dobbs. We know, I said, thinking of Earl's explanation. An old spirit. Something the Cherokee avoided. The brothers exchanged another look, this one clearly surprised. You know more than most, Harlan said appraisingly. Who told you that? I thought of Earl, likely dead now because he'd helped me escape. Met a man up there, older guy, living in a cave. Said his daughter was taken by whatever's in the hollows. Recognition flashed in their eyes. Earl Pierce, Curtis said with a nod. Crazy old bastard's still alive then. He was when I left him, I said carefully. Margaret was right behind us. He stayed behind so I could get away. Harlan snorted. Earl's harder to kill than he looks. He'll be fine. Something in his tone suggested a history between them, not necessarily a friendly one. So, what's your interest in all this? I asked, trying to sound casual. Ghost hunting, or something else? Curtis smiled, cold and predatory. Let's just say our family has a long relationship with what lives in the hollows. It's taken from us, and it's given to us. Balance, of a sort. Given to you? I echoed, confused and increasingly uneasy. Power, Harlan said simply. Knowledge. Things most folks wouldn't understand. He patted his rifle. These ain't for hunting deer, friend. They're for hunting other things. Are there others like Margaret? I asked, remembering what both she and Earl had said about not being alone in the hollows. The hollows is full of the dead, Curtis confirmed. Some are just echoes, harmless. Others, like your Margaret, have more substance. And then there's what's beneath it all, the thing that wears their faces. What is it? I asked, genuinely curious despite my fear. Earl didn't seem to know exactly. Harlan shrugged. Old as the mountains, hungry, lonely maybe, takes people, keeps them. His eyes hardened. And sometimes, if you know how to ask proper, it'll lend you a bit of its power. The implication was clear and horrifying. These men weren't fighting whatever haunted the hollows. They were in some kind of twisted partnership with it. You're working with it, I said, taking an involuntary step backward. You're helping it. Curtis laughed. More like it helps us, when our interests align. See, we Dobbs have been hunting in these mountains since before there was a Georgia. Got a reputation to maintain. Hunting what? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Whatever comes along, Harlan said with a smirk. Deer, boar, hikers who stick their noses where they don't belong. Scout's growl deepened. I rested my hand on her head, ready to signal her to run if necessary. The protective pouch seemed to grow heavier against my chest. So, what happens now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Now? Curtis fingered his rifle. Now we have a decision to make. The hollows let you go, which is mighty unusual. Means you're either very lucky or very interesting to it. I'd say both, Harlan added, studying me intently. That pouch around your neck, Earl's work, I'm guessing? Man always did have a talent for the old ways. I instinctively touched the leather pouch. He said it would protect me. And so it has, Curtis agreed. But protection's a funny thing out here. Sometimes what keeps one danger away attracts another. They were circling slightly, moving to flank me. I backed up, keeping both in my field of vision. "I just want to get back to my car and leave," I said. "I have no interest in whatever's going on between you and the Hollows." "See, that's the problem," Harlan said, his voice hardening. "Once the Hollows touches you, you're part of it. No walking away." Earl understood that. Why he's still here after all these years. "I'm nothing like Earl," I protested. "I'm just a guy who went camping in the wrong place." "Maybe," Curtis conceded, "but you've seen things most folks haven't. Knowledge is power out here, and power—" He raised his rifle slightly. "Well, power has a way of shifting." The threat was unmistakable now. These men weren't going to help me. They were deciding whether to kill me. Scout sensed it too, her body tensing beside me. "I won't tell anyone," I promised. "About Margaret, about the Hollows, about you. I just want to forget this ever happened." Harlan laughed. "Nobody forgets the Hollows once it's gotten under their skin. You'll be back. They always come back." As they moved closer, I frantically considered my options. Running wouldn't work. They had rifles. Fighting was suicide for the same reason. I needed a distraction. My hand closed around the hunting knife still in my pocket from the night before. Not much against rifles, but better than nothing. "What about a deal?" I suggested desperately. "You said the spirit makes trades. What if I could offer it something? Something better than me?" That got their attention. The brothers exchanged glances again. "What could you possibly offer?" Curtis asked skeptically. I thought quickly. "Information. From outside. News, developments, things that might want to know about the modern world." I was grasping at straws, but their hesitation suggested I might be onto something. "The old spirit doesn't care about the outside world," Harlan said dismissively. "It's been here since before there was an outside." "Then what does it want?" I pressed. "There must be something." Curtis studied me for a long moment. "Company," he said finally. "That's what Earl figured out. Why he's lasted so long. He visits his daughter regularly, talks to her, keeps it entertained." "I could do that," I said quickly. "Come back, visit, tell stories." Harlan scoffed. "You'd never come back voluntarily. Not after what you saw." "I would if it meant staying alive," I insisted. "I could come every year. Make it a pilgrimage." The brothers seemed to consider this. I held my breath, acutely aware that my life hung on their decision. Finally, Curtis nodded slowly. "Might work. The old spirit does love its rituals, its patterns." "One visit a year ain't much," Harlan objected. "Better than nothing," Curtis countered. "And if he doesn't show, we can always hunt him down." He smiled unpleasantly at me. "We're very good at finding people." I swallowed hard. "So we have a deal?" Harlan looked unhappy but nodded reluctantly. 1 year from today, you come back to the Hollows, spend the night at your old campsite. Talk to Margaret, or whatever's wearing her face. Tell it stories from outside. "And if I don't?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Curtis patted his rifle. "Then we come looking, and we won't be as understanding next time." It was a devil's bargain, but it was the only one available to me. "Deal," I agreed. "Swear it," Harlan demanded, "on something that matters to you." I thought for a moment, then placed my hand on Scout's head. "I swear on her life. 1 year from today, I'll return to the Hollows." The brothers seemed satisfied with this. Curtis lowered his rifle slightly. "Highway's 3 miles that way," he said, pointing south along the logging road. "Follow it till it hits asphalt. You can hitch a ride to Helen from there." "What about Earl?" I asked. "Is he really still alive?" Harlan shrugged. "Probably. Man survived worse than Margaret Radley." I hesitated, then asked one final question. "The old spirit, the thing beneath, does it have a name?" The brothers exchanged one last look, then Curtis answered, The Cherokee called it Nunyunuwi, the Stone Man. Said it was here when they arrived. We'll be here long after we're gone. He gestured toward the mountains. Best not to speak its name too loud, though. Names have power in the hollows. With that ominous warning, they stepped aside, clearing my path to continue down the logging road. I moved past them carefully, Scout staying close to my side, her eyes never leaving them. 1 year, Harlan called after me. Don't forget. I won't, I promised, already knowing I'd never be able to forget any of this if I lived to be 100. We walked away quickly, not running, but moving with purpose. I didn't look back until we'd rounded a bend in the road and the clearing was no longer visible. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Scout seemed to relax too, though she remained vigilant as we continued our journey. The logging road gradually improved as we moved south, eventually showing signs of occasional use. Tire tracks in the mud, beer cans in the ditches. 3 miles later, just as Curtis had said, we emerged onto a paved county highway. I checked my phone, battery at 27%, but still enough to confirm we were about 12 miles from Helen. I tucked the protective pouch more securely under my shirt and started walking, thumb out whenever a vehicle approached. The third car stopped, a middle-aged couple in a Subaru who looked like they were on a weekend getaway. They asked few questions about my disheveled appearance, seeming to accept my story about getting lost while hiking. They dropped us at a gas station on the outskirts of Helen, where I was able to call a taxi to take us back to my car. The drive to the trailhead near Trey Mountain was tense. I half expected to see Margaret standing among the trees, or the Dobbs brothers waiting for me, but nothing unusual happened. My car was exactly where I'd left it, untouched. Within minutes, Scout and I were heading south, back toward Atlanta and away from the hollows. I've spent the 6 months since then trying to make sense of what happened. Researching local history turned up scattered references to the Radley case, officially ruled a disappearance, though locals clearly suspected murder. The logging camp accident in the 1950s was better documented. 6 men killed when equipment failed. And I found newspaper clippings about the murder-suicide of a family in 1978 on a ridge that seemed to match Earl's description. Cherokee legends about the Nunyunuwi were harder to find but consistent with what the Dobbs brothers had told me. An ancient spirit that could take human form, that demanded respect and occasionally sacrifice. I've considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I met a ghost? That 2 local men made me swear to return to talk to an ancient spirit? That a hermit who'd been living in the woods for 15 years saved my life before possibly losing his own? None of it would sound credible. So I've prepared instead. I've studied protection symbols from multiple traditions, created my own version of Earl's pouch based on what research I could find. I've practiced camping in other forests, kept myself physically fit, and made sure Scout's training is impeccable. Because in 4 months and 13 days, I have to return to the hollows. To the clearing by the creek where I first met Margaret Radley, to fulfill a promise made under duress but binding nonetheless. I don't know what will happen when I go back, whether Margaret will be waiting, or the Dobbs brothers, or Earl, if he survived. Whether the ancient spirit will find my stories interesting enough to let me leave again. Whether I'll become another face it wears, another voice in the drowning depths of the creek. All I know is that the Hollows is waiting, and, like Harlan Dobbs said, once it touches you, you're part of it. There's no walking away, not really. Sometimes at night, I dream of water closing over my head, of faces watching from the depths, and among them now is Earl Pierce, his eyes sad but determined, still fighting his lonely battle for his daughter's soul. And sometimes, just as I'm waking, I hear Margaret's voice distorted, as if speaking through water. "See you soon, Elijah." Maybe I will. Maybe, like Earl, I'll find myself unable to leave once I return. Or maybe I'll survive another encounter, make another bargain, buy myself another year of freedom. But one thing I know for certain, the Hollows has claimed me, one way or another, and deep down, in a place I don't like to acknowledge, part of me is eager to go back, to learn more, to understand what lives in those ancient valleys and what it wants from us, because that's the real horror of the Hollows. Not that it takes you, but that eventually, you want it to. My name is Elijah Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024, and it isn't over yet. My name is Thomas Westfield, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The thing about trauma is that it doesn't just break you, it hollows you out, leaving empty spaces where solid parts of yourself used to be. After Rachel died, I became a collection of these empty spaces held together by routine and obligation. My therapist suggested I needed to reconnect with nature to help process my grief. That's why I found myself driving toward the Cahoota wilderness with my German Shepherd, Duke, riding shotgun in my beat-up Ford Ranger. I should have known better. Empty spaces don't stay empty for long. Something always finds its way in. The Cahoota Wilderness in North Georgia spans over 40,000 acres of dense forest, steep ridges, and isolated valleys. I'd chosen a remote trail near Jacks River Falls, planning a 5-day solo backpacking trip. Duke panted happily beside me as I steered up the winding mountain road, his warm presence the only comfort I'd known in the 18 months since the accident. My phone lost signal about 20 minutes before I reached the trailhead parking area. There were no other vehicles when I arrived, unsurprising for a Wednesday in late October. I double-checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, first aid kit, food for Duke and me, extra layers for the cold nights, everything in its place, meticulously organized, just as Rachel had taught me. Ready, boy. I rubbed behind Duke's ears. He nudged my hand with his nose, eager to explore. At least one of us was excited about this trip. The trailhead sign warned of bears and advised hikers to properly store food. Nothing unusual. A smaller, weathered sign beneath it caught my attention. Respect the wilderness and those who dwell within. Something about the phrasing made my skin prickle, but I dismissed it. Just typical Forest Service language. For the first few hours, the hike was exactly what my therapist had promised. Therapeutic. The forest breathed around us as we climbed higher into the wilderness. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of red and gold autumn leaves. Duke trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to wait for me, his tail wagging with boundless enthusiasm. We made good progress, and by late afternoon, we reached a small clearing beside Jacks River. I set up camp, built a small fire, and watched as the daylight slowly faded. Duke lay beside me, his head on my lap as I stared into the flames. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace, until I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees or the gentle flow of the river. But then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, melodic voice speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Duke's ears perked up. He lifted his head, suddenly alert. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" No response, just the crackling of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. "Must be imagining things," I muttered to Duke, who had risen to his feet, his posture tense. "It's okay, boy." But it wasn't okay. Duke's hackles were raised, and he stared intently into the darkness beyond our campsite. A low growl rumbled from his chest. "What is it? You see something?" I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but shadows. Duke continued to growl, his eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the reach of my light. Eventually, Duke settled down, though he remained vigilant throughout the evening. I chalked it up to wildlife, probably a raccoon or deer. By the time I crawled into my tent that night, I'd convinced myself that the whisper had been nothing more than my imagination, my mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar environment. I was wrong. The dream came first. Rachel standing in our kitchen, her back to me as she washed dishes. "Rachel!" I called out, knowing it couldn't be real but desperate to touch her anyway. She turned, water dripping from her hands, but her face wasn't right. It was stretched, distorted, like looking at a reflection in a warped mirror. Her eyes were too wide, her smile too broad, revealing too many teeth. "Why did you leave me there, Tom?" she asked, her voice a horrible multi-toned sound that made my teeth vibrate. "Why didn't you come back for me?" I woke with a strangled gasp, my body drenched in cold sweat. The interior of the tent was pitch black. Duke wasn't beside me. "Duke!" I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart racing. "Duke, where are you?" The zipper of my tent was open. I was certain I'd closed it before going to sleep. I shined the light outside. Duke's sleeping pad was empty. Panic seized me as I scrambled out of the tent, calling his name. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the clearing. The night was unnaturally quiet. No insect sounds, no rustling leaves, nothing. "Duke!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Only silence answered. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed my larger flashlight, and began searching the perimeter of the campsite. That's when I saw the footprints in the soft dirt. Not Duke's paw prints, but human footprints, small and barefoot, leading away from my tent toward the river. Following the tracks, I reached the edge of the water. The footprints stopped abruptly at the riverbank. I swept my flashlight across the surface of the water, and my blood froze. A figure stood in the middle of the river, the water reaching only to its ankles despite the river being at least 4 feet deep at its center. It was a woman, no, a girl, with long dark hair that hung in wet ropes around a pale face. She wore what looked like a dirty white nightgown, soaked and clinging to her thin frame. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. She just stood there, unnaturally still, her face obscured by her hair. "I'm looking for my dog," I tried again. "Have you seen him? A German Shepherd?" Slowly, the figure raised her head. I caught a glimpse of her face. Hollow eye sockets, gray skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, and a mouth that seemed too wide for her face, filled with needle-like teeth. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming still. The figure took a step toward me, but instead of creating ripples, the water around her feet remained perfectly still, as if she were walking on solid ground. A bark from behind me made me jump. Duke burst from the trees, racing toward me with such force that he nearly knocked me over. "Duke! Jesus Christ, where were you?" I grabbed his collar, immensely relieved to see him. He barked again, urgent and alarmed, pulling me back toward the campsite. I glanced back at the river. The figure was gone. With Duke leading the way, we hurried back to camp. Everything looked undisturbed, yet something felt profoundly wrong. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The surrounding forest watched us with malevolent intent. "We're leaving at first light," I told Duke, who whined softly in response. There was no way I could sleep now, so I rebuilt the fire and sat beside it. Duke pressed against my side, both of us facing outward toward the darkness. That's when I noticed the carvings on the trees surrounding our campsite. Crude symbols etched into the bark, spirals and angular shapes that resembled primitive letters. I was certain they hadn't been there earlier. The rest of the night passed in tense vigilance. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Duke remained alert, occasionally growling at movements in the darkness that I couldn't perceive. Dawn finally broke, a pale light seeping through the trees. I hastily packed up camp, my hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, something fell out. A small bundle of twigs bound together with what looked like human hair. I flung it away with a cry of disgust. "Let's go, Duke," I said, shouldering my pack. "Let's get the hell out of here." But as we started back down the trail, I realized something was wrong. The path didn't look the same as it had the day before. The landmarks I'd noted were missing or altered. After an hour of walking, we should have reached a distinctive rock formation, but there was no sign of it. I stopped, pulling out my map and compass. According to the compass, we were headed south, but that couldn't be right. The trailhead was to the east. I turned around, intending to retrace our steps to the campsite and start again, but the trail behind us had changed as well, narrowing and winding between unfamiliar trees. "This is impossible," I muttered, checking the compass again. The needle spun wildly, never settling in one direction. Duke whined, pressing against my leg. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, clearer now, a woman's voice singing softly. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas. Thomas, lost his way, wandering in the woods all day. Thomas, led astray, never, ever going away. Duke barked sharply, his eyes fixed on something in the trees ahead. I squinted, trying to see what had caught his attention. A figure moved between the trunks, too quick to identify. "Hello?" I called out. "Can you help us? I think we're lost." A laugh echoed through the forest. A child's laugh, high and musical, but with something wrong beneath it, like fingernails scraping against metal. Duke growled, backing up against me. Another figure darted between the trees to our right, then another to our left. We were being surrounded. "Come on," I urged Duke, choosing a direction at random and moving as quickly as I could through the underbrush. Behind us, twigs snapped and leaves rustled as whatever was in the forest followed. We emerged into a small clearing and stopped short. In the center stood a crude structure, a cabin built of weathered logs and stones, its roof sagging in the middle, its single window dark and empty like a dead eye. The door hung partially open, swaying slightly though there was no breeze. Every instinct screamed at me to run in the opposite direction. But where would I go? We were hopelessly lost, and night would fall again in a few hours. At least the cabin offered shelter, a place to regroup and figure out our next move. "Stay close," I told Duke, who seemed reluctant to approach the structure. Drawing my hunting knife, more for reassurance than practical protection, I moved cautiously toward the cabin. The interior was dim and smelled of damp earth and something else, a sweet, rotting odor that made my stomach turn. A crude table stood in the center of the single room, surrounded by 3 mismatched chairs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes piled within. In the corner was a narrow bed covered with a stained quilt. But it was what hung from the ceiling that made me freeze. Dozens of small bundles similar to the one I'd found in my sleeping bag. Twigs and bones and hair tied together, dangling on strings above the table. Duke refused to enter, standing at the threshold with his tail between his legs. "I don't blame you," I said, backing out of the cabin. This place was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. As I turned to leave, my eye caught something scratched into the wooden door frame. A name. Eliza Blackwell, 1834-1862. Below it, freshly carved, were more words. "She knows you're here, Thomas." My blood turned to ice. How could anyone know my name? I'd told no one about this trip except my therapist, and I hadn't encountered another soul since entering the wilderness. Duke's sudden bark made me jump. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, an old man, stooped and weathered, with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed too bright in his wrinkled face. He leaned on a walking stick, watching us with an unreadable expression. "You shouldn't be here," he called, his voice surprisingly strong for his apparent age. "This isn't a place for the living." "I'm lost," I replied, torn between relief at finding another person and a deep, instinctive wariness. "My dog and we can't find our way back to the trail." The old man nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "They've taken an interest in you. Been a while since anyone came this deep into her territory." "Whose territory?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Eliza Blackwell." He gestured toward the cabin. "Folks called her the Witch of Cahoota. Story goes, she murdered her husband and 2 children before hanging herself from that big oak by the river. That was over 160 years ago, but some things don't rest easy, especially when they've got unfinished business. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't believe in ghosts. The old man smiled, revealing teeth stained brown from tobacco. Don't matter what you believe, she believes in you. How do you know my name? I demanded. His smile widened. I don't, but she does. He tapped his walking stick against the ground. You've been marked, son. That's why you can't find your way out. She's twisted the paths, turned the forest against you. Duke growled, his hackles rising again. I put a hand on his head to steady him, and myself. How do I get out? I asked. The old man seemed to consider this. There's a way. Always is, but it'll cost you. Cost me what? A sacrifice. His eyes flicked to Duke. She's always had a fondness for animals. Their spirits are pure, uncomplicated. A surge of protective rage swept through me. Absolutely not. Duke stays with me. The old man shrugged. Then you'll both stay here. Once night falls again, she'll come for you proper. What she'll do then. He made a cutting motion across his throat. There has to be another way, I insisted. Well, he scratched his beard thoughtfully. There is her grave. You could try to appease her, offer something of value, not to me, to her, something you cherish. Leave it at her grave with the proper words, and she might let you go. Where's the grave? I asked, desperately hoping this was all some elaborate hoax, or perhaps a psychotic break on my part, anything but real. The old man pointed with his walking stick. Follow the crows. They gather there, feeding on what little remains of her malice. But be careful. The others will try to stop you. Others? Her victims. His expression darkened. Some joined her willingly in the end, twisted by her magic into things no longer human. Others she keeps against their will, trapped between life and death. He took a step back. I've said too much. She'll know I've helped you. Before I could ask anything else, he turned and walked into the forest, his form seeming to waver and dim with each step until he vanished among the trees. Duke whined softly, pressing against my leg. I know, boy, I said, trying to sound brave for both our sakes. But what choice do we have? As if in answer to the old man's words, a crow landed on a nearby branch, its black eyes regarding us with eerie intelligence. It cawed once, then took flight, circling before heading deeper into the forest. I guess we follow, I said to Duke, who seemed distinctly unhappy with this plan but stayed loyally by my side as we left the clearing. The crow led us along a winding path that I was certain hadn't existed before. The forest grew thicker, the trees pressing closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out much of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began to fog in the air. More crows joined the first, creating a black, cawing procession through the trees. Their calls echoed strangely, sometimes sounding almost like words, warnings or threats I couldn't tell. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted it had only been 45 minutes. The forest had taken on a dreamlike quality, with distances seeming to stretch and compress unpredictably. Several times I caught glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, pale figures flitting between trees, always just out of clear sight. Duke stayed unnervingly close, occasionally growling at things I couldn't see. His animal senses were clearly detecting threats beyond my human perception. The crows finally led us to another clearing, smaller than the one with the cabin. In its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, its branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. At its base was a small mound of earth marked by a crude headstone, just a flat piece of stone with the initials EB carved into it. The crows settled in the branches of the oak, their black bodies stark against the autumn leaves. They watched us with an unsettling, collective intelligence. This must be it, I said quietly to Duke. "Eliza Blackwell's grave." As I approached the grave, the air grew even colder. My breath clouded heavily, and a strange pressure built in my ears, as if I were deep underwater. Duke whined, reluctant to get any closer. "It's okay," I told him, though I didn't believe it myself. "Stay there if you want." The old man had said I needed to offer something I cherished, something of value. I had few possessions with me that qualified, except... My hand went to my chest, where Rachel's wedding ring hung on a chain beneath my shirt. I'd worn it there since the accident, unable to part with this last physical connection to her. The thought of leaving it here, in this forsaken place, made my chest tighten with renewed grief. But what choice did I have? I pulled the chain over my head, the gold ring catching what little light filtered through the trees. It had been my grandmother's before I gave it to Rachel, a family heirloom passed down through generations. As I knelt before the grave, the forest went completely silent. Even the crows ceased their cawing. Duke growled, a continuous low sound of warning. "Eliza Blackwell," I said, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the strange air. "I offer you this ring. It belonged to my wife, Rachel. My voice caught. "She died in a car accident 18 months ago. This ring is the most precious thing I own. I'm giving it to you freely in exchange for safe passage out of your forest." I placed the ring and chain on the grave mound. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the soil shifted, and the ring began to sink into the ground as if being drawn down by invisible hands. A whisper came from behind me, the same melodic voice I'd heard before, but clearer now, each word distinct. "A pretty trinket for a grieving husband, but metal and stone hold no true value. What I want is your pain, Thomas Westfield, your delicious, exquisite pain." I spun around. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and unnaturally thin, wearing a tattered white dress that might once have been a wedding gown. Her long black hair fell in tangles around a face that shifted between beauty and horror with each subtle movement, like two images superimposed over each other. Where her eyes should have been were empty sockets, yet I could feel her gaze boring into me. Duke backed away, barking frantically. "You've carried your grief like a shield," Eliza said, her mouth barely moving as the words formed in the air between us. "Using it to keep the world at bay. Such perfect isolation, almost as perfect as mine." She took a step forward, and the ground beneath her bare feet withered, grass turning brown and brittle. "I don't understand what you want," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, you do." Her head tilted at an impossible angle. "You want to join Rachel. Every day since she died, some small part of you has wished to follow her into the dark. I can make that happen. I can reunite you." A figure materialized beside her. Rachel, exactly as she'd looked the last time I saw her alive, smiling that crooked smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. "Tom," the apparition said, holding out her hand, "I've missed you so much." My heart twisted painfully in my chest. Even knowing it was a trick, some cruel manipulation, I couldn't help the surge of longing that swept through me. "That's not Rachel," I said, more to myself than to Eliza. "Rachel is gone." "Is she?" Eliza asked, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "Or is she trapped, like all my little birds, waiting for someone to set her free?" She stroked Rachel's hair with long, skeletal fingers. "I could arrange a trade. Your dog's life for a moment with your wife. A fair exchange, don't you think?" Duke had backed up to the far side of the clearing, still barking at Eliza and the false Rachel. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. The old man's words came back to me. "She murdered her husband and 2 children before hanging herself." This entity fed on pain, on grief and loss and guilt. And I had been feeding her with my own since the moment I entered her forest. "No," I said firmly. "No deals, no trades. Rachel wouldn't want that. And I don't think you can give me what you're offering anyway. You're just a parasite, feeding on other people's suffering." Eliza's form flickered, like a television with poor reception. The false Rachel wavered and distorted. "You dare!" Eliza hissed, her voice losing its melodic quality, becoming a harsh, grating sound. "You are in my domain, Thomas Westfield. You will not leave until I permit it." "You're wrong," I replied, a plan forming in my mind. "This isn't about permission. This is about power, and you only have power over me if I give it to you." I turned back to the grave and snatched up the chain and ring before they could sink completely into the soil. Eliza screamed, a horrifying sound that shook the trees and sent the crows exploding into flight. "Duke, come!" I shouted, running toward the tree line opposite from where Eliza stood. Duke bolted to my side, and together we plunged back into the forest. Behind us, Eliza's rage manifested as a cold wind that tore through the trees, ripping leaves from branches and sending fallen timber crashing to the ground. The false Rachel's voice called after me, pleading, but I didn't look back. We ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs with no direction except away from Eliza's grave. The forest blurred around us, trees seeming to shift position, paths appearing and disappearing. Sometimes we passed the same distinctive rock or tree multiple times, trapped in some kind of spatial loop. Pale figures darted among the trees, Eliza's victims, the others the old man had mentioned. Some reached out with elongated arms as we passed, fingers grasping at my pack and clothes. Duke snapped at them, keeping them at bay. My lungs burned, and my legs threatened to give out, but terror kept me moving. Duke stayed right beside me, his loyalty unwavering even in the face of supernatural horror. Suddenly, we burst through a particularly dense section of undergrowth and found ourselves on a narrow dirt road. In the distance, I could see the roof of a small building, a ranger station. "We made it," I gasped to Duke, who was panting heavily but still alert, his eyes scanning the forest behind us. As we started toward the station, a figure stepped onto the road ahead, the old man with the walking stick. "Impressive," he said, nodding appreciatively. "Few escape her once she set her sights on them." "Who are you?" I demanded. "What is your role in all this?" The old man chuckled. "Just another lost soul, though I made my peace with Eliza long ago. I guide the occasional traveler who wanders too deep, give them a fighting chance. Most don't take it." "The sacrifices," I said, understanding dawning. "You send people to her as offerings." He shrugged. "Better one soul willingly given than dozens taken by force. She must feed, you see? Her hunger is insatiable. So you're her accomplice." My hand tightened around Rachel's ring. I prefer to think of myself as a necessary mediator. He tapped his walking stick against the ground. "In any case, you've earned your freedom, Thomas Westfield. But heed my warning. She'll remember you. Should you ever return to the Cahoota wilderness, she'll be waiting, and she won't be so easily denied a second time." Before I could respond, he turned and walked back into the forest, his form fading with each step until he vanished entirely. Duke and I continued to the ranger station, where a startled park ranger informed me that we were over 15 miles from where I'd set up camp the previous night, an impossible distance to have covered on foot in less than a day, especially given the difficult terrain. I invented a story about getting lost and walking through the night, which the ranger accepted with skepticism but didn't challenge. He drove us back to my truck, which sat alone in the trailhead parking lot, exactly as I'd left it. As I loaded Duke into the passenger seat, I noticed something on the windshield. A small bundle of twigs and hair, identical to the one I'd found in my sleeping bag. I brushed it away with a shudder and got in the truck, starting the engine and pulling out of the lot as quickly as I could. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a tall, thin figure standing at the trailhead, a woman in white with long dark hair. Beside her stood a smaller figure that made my heart stop. Rachel, or something wearing her shape, watching me leave with those empty, haunting eyes. I drove for hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the Cahoota wilderness. Duke slept beside me, exhausted from our ordeal but mercifully unharmed. That night, in a motel room 50 miles away, I dreamt of Eliza Blackwell. She stood in a forest clearing, surrounded by pale, twisted figures, her collection of victims. She looked directly at me and smiled, revealing those needle-like teeth. "Until we meet again, Thomas Westfield," she whispered. "I'll be keeping your lovely Rachel company in the meantime." I woke gasping, clutching Rachel's ring so tightly that the edges cut into my palm. It's been 6 months since my encounter in the Cahoota wilderness. I've moved to Arizona, about as far from Georgia as I could reasonably go. Duke is still with me, though he's never quite been the same, more alert, more suspicious of shadows. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I hear a familiar melodic whisper calling my name, and sometimes, in mirrors or windows, I catch a glimpse of Rachel standing behind me, her eyes hollow and dark, her mouth stretched in an unnatural smile. My therapist says it's PTSD from my traumatic experience getting lost in the woods. She's partially right, I suppose, but she doesn't understand the truth, that some empty spaces should stay empty, because what fills them might be far worse than the absence. I still wear Rachel's ring around my neck. Some nights I wake to find it's turned cold against my skin, as if all warmth has been leached from the metal. And on those nights, I lie awake until dawn, Duke pressed against my side, both of us watching the shadows for signs of movement. Because Eliza Blackwell is patient. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that someday, whether in a month or a year or a decade, I'll find myself back in those woods, standing before her grave, making a different choice. And Rachel will be waiting. My name is Daniel Harmon, and I am 34 years old. This happened in June 2024. The first drops of rain hit my windshield as I drove deeper into the Cahoota wilderness. Each mile of winding road took me further from civilization and closer to what I hoped would be 3 days of peace. Just me, my German Shepherd Rex, and the North Georgia mountains. After my sister Elaine's funeral last month, I'd been functioning on autopilot. Work, home, minimal sleep, repeat. My therapist had been pushing me to get away, insisting I needed space to process. So when my coworker Trevor mentioned his family cabin near Blood Creek, I jumped at the opportunity. "Nobody's used it in years," he'd said, sliding a hand-drawn map across my desk. "Probably needs airing out, but the generator should work. It's about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, place called Wilder's Gap. Not even on most maps." I'd thanked him, desperately needing solitude. The mountains had always been my sanctuary. Rex whined from the back seat as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Almost there, buddy," I said, squinting through the intensifying rain. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but Trevor's map showed we were close. The road narrowed, trees crowding closer on both sides, branches scraping against the car like fingernails. The daylight was fading quickly, darkness accelerated by the storm clouds overhead. I slowed as we approached what appeared to be a small community, if you could call 5 dilapidated buildings a community. A weathered sign, barely legible through the rain, read, "Wilder's Gap, Esterty 1887. I pulled over beside what looked like an ancient general store, its windows boarded up, a rusted Coca-Cola sign hanging askew from one corner. According to Trevor's directions, I needed to take the next right to find the dirt road leading to the cabin. I sat there, engine idling, rain hammering the roof. Something about this place felt wrong. The buildings weren't just abandoned, they seemed to be watching me. Rex's low growl from the back seat confirmed my unease. "It's okay, boy," I said, not entirely convinced myself. "Just an old ghost town." I continued driving, finding the turnoff a quarter mile down the road. The road was barely more than a trail. my SUV rocking violently as we navigated deep ruts and exposed roots. The trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches intertwining like gnarled fingers, blocking what little daylight remained. After what felt like an eternity of crawling forward in low gear, the woods opened to reveal a small clearing, and there sat Trevor's family cabin. It was larger than I'd expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney. It looked rustic but solid, its dark windows staring blankly as my headlights swept across the facade. I parked as close as possible, grabbing my duffel bag and Rex's food before making a dash through the downpour. The key was exactly where Trevor said it would be, under a fake rock beside the porch steps. The door creaked open, revealing darkness and the musty smell of long-abandoned spaces. Rex hesitated at the threshold, hackles raised. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, stepping inside and feeling along the wall for a light switch. Nothing happened when I flipped it. Right, the generator. I fumbled for my phone flashlight and made my way through the main room, past shapes of sheet-covered furniture, toward where Trevor had indicated the generator controls would be. After some trial and error in the basement, I managed to get the generator running, its low rumble vibrating through the floorboards as lights flickered on throughout the cabin. The place was straight out of the 1980s. Wood-paneled walls, plaid furniture, and a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Despite its dated appearance, it was clean, almost too clean for a place that supposedly hadn't been used in years. I brought in the rest of my supplies from the car while Rex sniffed every corner, still on edge. After unloading, I built a fire to drive away the dampness and settled onto the couch with a whiskey, Rex finally relaxing at my feet. The storm intensified outside, wind howling through the trees and rain lashing against the windows. I was exhausted but content. The isolation exactly what I needed. Within minutes of finishing my drink, I was drifting off to sleep. I awoke with a start, heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed me. The fire had died to embers, casting the room in a dull red glow. Rex was standing rigid, staring at the front door, a continuous low growl emanating from deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, suddenly alert. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping at the door. 3 distinct taps, then silence. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Who would be at the door in the middle of the night in this storm, miles from anywhere? The tapping came again, more insistent this time. I reached for my phone, cursing when I saw no signal. The cabin had no landline. "Who's there?" I called, reaching for the poker from the fireplace, its weight reassuring in my hand. No answer, just another series of taps, almost rhythmic now. Rex's growl deepened as I approached the door, knuckles white around the poker. I peered through the peephole but could see nothing in the darkness outside. "I have a dog," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing pulse. "And I'm armed." The tapping stopped. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing but the storm. After a full minute of silence, I began to wonder if I'd imagined it, if it had been a branch knocked loose by the wind. I was about to return to the couch when a voice came from directly outside the door. A child's voice, high and clear despite the storm's fury. "Please let me in, mister. I'm lost." Ice flooded my veins. The voice was wrong, too steady, too composed for a child caught in this nightmare of a storm. "Where are your parents?" I called, staying well back from the door. "Gone," the voice replied, the single word somehow conveying both innocence and something ancient. "Please, I'm so cold." Rex was now baring his teeth, eyes fixed on the door, his growl never ceasing. "I can't open the door," I said, "but I can call for help." A lie. No signal, no landline. But the words came automatically. Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then, softly, "You're lying." The voice had changed, dropping an octave, shedding its childlike quality. The words slithered through the door like oil. "They always lie," it continued, lower still, no longer even attempting to sound human. Just like your sister lied. My breath caught in my throat. "What did you say?" I demanded, cold dread pooling in my stomach. "Elaine," the voice hissed, each syllable stretched obscenely. "She promised she'd be there for you, didn't she, Daniel? But she lied. She left you all alone." My sister's name in that thing's mouth hit me like a physical blow. Elaine's death had been sudden, an aneurysm, they said. No warning, no goodbye. One moment on the phone laughing with me, the next gone forever. She'd been my only family since our parents died. "Who are you?" My voice cracked. "How do you know about my sister?" A low chuckle seeped through the door, the sound like bones grinding together. "I know everything about you, Daniel Harmon. I've been waiting for you." Rex's barking reached a fever pitch. I backed away from the door, dragging him with me by the collar. "You're not welcome here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Leave now." The laughter stopped abruptly. When the voice came again, it was directly beside my ear, as if whatever was outside had somehow crossed the threshold. "I've always been here, Daniel. This has always been mine." I spun around, swinging the poker wildly, but encountered nothing but air. Rex lunged against my grip, barking frantically at empty space. Then every light in the cabin went out simultaneously, plunging us into absolute darkness as the generator died. In the sudden silence, I could hear movement. Something circling the cabin, its footsteps heavy on the porch, testing each window, each potential entrance. I fumbled for my phone, its weak light barely penetrating the darkness. With shaking hands, I tried calling emergency services despite knowing there was no signal. The call failed instantly. The scratching began next, long, deliberate strokes against the wooden walls, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. It wasn't random, it was methodical, as if whatever was out there was testing the structural integrity of my shelter, searching for weakness. I dragged the coffee table against the door, then added an armchair for good measure. I checked every window, making sure they were locked, pulling closed every curtain. When I reached the kitchen window, I froze. A face was pressed against the glass, watching me. It had the basic structure of a human face, but was horribly wrong. The skin was gray and papery, stretched too tight over an oversized skull. The eyes were black pits, reflecting nothing. And the mouth was too wide, filled with needle-like teeth, curved into a grin that split the face nearly in half. I stumbled backward with a strangled cry as the thing tapped one long, bone-white finger against the glass, its nail clicking like a metronome. Rex charged the window, barking hysterically. The face vanished instantly, but I could hear its laughter receding around the side of the cabin. I spent the remainder of that endless night huddled in the center of the living room, back to back with Rex, the poker in one hand and my useless phone in the other, listening to the thing as it circled us like a shark, sometimes scratching, sometimes tapping, sometimes whispering my name or Elaine's in that horrible knowing voice. Near dawn, it finally went quiet. The rain stopped, and gray light began filtering through the curtains. I waited an hour past sunrise before cautiously approaching a window and peeking out. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light, mist rising from the rain-soaked ground, birds singing in the trees. I could almost believe I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the night's horrors had been hallucinations born of grief and isolation. Almost, except for the tracks in the mud around the cabin. Not human tracks, but not animal either. They were too large, the toes too long and curled, with deep impressions as if whatever made them had been extraordinarily heavy. I needed to leave. Now. But first, I had to know what I was dealing with. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my satellite radio, a backup I'd brought for emergencies, capable of receiving signals even in remote areas. I tuned to the local station, hoping for weather reports, and instead caught the end of what sounded like a news bulletin. "Marks the 5th disappearance in the Blood Creek area this year," the announcer was saying. "Local authorities continue to advise against camping or hiking in the vicinity of Wilder's Gap. The search for missing hiker Carl Jenkins enters its third week with no leads. My blood ran cold. I increased the volume. In related news, historians and folklorists continue to debate the origins of the so-called Wilder witch legends that have persisted in the region since the late 1800s. Some sources connect the recent disappearances to the historical accounts of Agatha Wilder, an alleged practitioner of folk magic who was executed by local residents in 1887 after a series of child disappearances. I thought of the voice outside my door, how it had started as a child's before revealing itself as something else entirely. Local historian Margaret Calhoun has published a collection of first-hand accounts from the Wilder's Gap incidents, including journals suggesting that Agatha Wilder swore revenge on the town and its descendants moments before her execution, promising to walk these woods until the end of days and claim what was owed to her. I shut off the radio, hands shaking. This wasn't a random encounter. Something had drawn me here, had perhaps even manipulated Trevor into offering his cabin. I threw my belongings into my bag haphazardly, desperate to be gone. Rex sensed my urgency, staying close to my heels as I moved through the cabin. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on a framed photograph on the mantel, one I hadn't noticed the night before. It showed a family standing in front of this very cabin, smiling at the camera. I recognized Trevor on the right, but my attention was drawn to the elderly woman in the center, her eyes sharp and knowing even in the faded image. I stepped closer, pulse quickening. On the back of the frame, written in faded ink, Wilder Family Reunion, 1979. Wilder. Not just the name of the town, but Trevor's family name. He'd known. He'd sent me here deliberately. I practically ran to my car, Rex leaping into the back seat before I'd fully opened the door. The engine started on the first try. A small mercy. I reversed too quickly, nearly hitting a tree in my haste to turn around. As I shifted into drive, I glanced at the cabin one last time and saw her standing on the porch. She looked almost human from a distance. An elderly woman in a dark dress, gray hair pulled back severely from her face. But as I watched, her form seemed to flicker, like static on an old television, revealing glimpses of something else beneath the human disguise, something ancient and hungry and patient. She raised one hand, not in farewell, but in promise, a promise that this wasn't over. I floored the accelerator, the SUV bouncing violently down the rutted path. In the rearview mirror, I saw her step off the porch and begin walking calmly after us, moving with impossible speed for what appeared to be an elderly woman, closing the distance even as I pushed the vehicle to its limits. When we finally reached the main road, I didn't slow down until we were 20 miles away, my hands cramping from their death grip on the steering wheel. I tried to report what happened, of course. The sheriff in the nearest town listened politely before explaining that Wilder's Gap had been abandoned since the 1950s after the local mine closed. When I insisted the buildings were still there, he smiled sadly, as if humoring a child. Those structures were demolished decades ago, son. The whole area's been part of the wildlife preserve since '62. When I mentioned Trevor's cabin, his expression changed. There was a cabin out that way, he said slowly, belonged to the last of the Wilder family. Burned down in '95 with the owner inside. Agatha Wilder. Reclusive old woman. They say she was the great-granddaughter of the original Agatha, named after her. I felt sick. That's impossible. I stayed there last night. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Son, there's nothing out there but ruins and bad memories. I drove back the next day in daylight, half convinced I'd lost my mind. But I found the turnoff easily enough, the dirt road still visible. When I reached the clearing, my heart nearly stopped. The cabin stood exactly as I'd left it, solid and real in the afternoon sunlight. But as I approached on foot, leaving my car at a safe distance, the image seemed to waver, like heat rising from hot pavement. From certain angles, I could see through the illusion to what lay beneath. A blackened foundation, collapsed timbers, the charred remains of what had once been a stone chimney. A mirage, but one solid enough to have sheltered me through the night. I was about to retreat when I noticed something on what had appeared to be the front porch, a small object that caught the sunlight. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I approached cautiously. It was Elaine's pendant, a small amber stone wrapped in silver wire that she'd never taken off, the same pendant that had been buried with her. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, I opened it to find a note written in an elegant, antique hand. "Blood calls to blood, Daniel Harmon. Your sister answered when I called. Now it's your turn. I have been patient for so long." The paper crumbled to dust in my hands, as ancient and fragile as if it had been written a century ago. I ran back to my car, the pendant clutched tightly in my fist, its surface unnaturally warm against my skin. It's been 3 weeks since my encounter at Blood Creek. I've moved 3 times, changed my phone number twice. I've consulted psychics, priests, paranormal researchers, anyone who wouldn't immediately dismiss me as delusional. The pendant sits on my nightstand as I write this, a reminder that I'm not crazy. Sometimes I catch it moving from the corner of my eye, rotating slightly as if guided by an unseen hand. Rex barks at empty corners of whatever motel room we're staying in that night. I've started seeing her in crowds, glimpses of that severe gray hair, the dark dress. Just yesterday, a barista called out an order for Agatha, and when I turned, an elderly woman was watching me, her smile too wide, her eyes too knowing. My research has led me down rabbit holes of local history and folklore. It seems Agatha Wilder wasn't just executed for the missing children. She was suspected of something far worse. The journals describe rituals, blood sacrifices designed to extend life beyond natural limits. They say she consumed parts of her victims, believing it would bind their life force to hers. Most disturbing are the references to family lines, how Agatha allegedly targeted specific bloodlines that had wronged her, patiently hunting down their descendants over decades. I've traced my family history back 4 generations and found the connection I was dreading. My great-great-grandfather, William Harmon, was among those who captured and executed Agatha Wilder in 1887. He's named specifically in her final curse. Trevor hasn't returned to work. His apartment was found empty, mail piled up for weeks. When I finally broke in, desperate for answers, I found only a single photograph pinned to the wall, the same family reunion photo I'd seen at the cabin, but with one difference. Every face had been burned away except for the elderly woman in the center. On the back, a message: "Family takes care of family." I don't know how much time I have left. If you're reading this, it means I've either found a way to end this or she's finally found me. Either way, stay away from Blood Creek and Wilder's Gap. What walks those woods isn't human and never was, and if a coworker or friend offers you their cabin in the mountains, for God's sake, say no. My phone is ringing now. The caller ID shows my sister's number, Elaine's number, the phone that was buried with her. I'm going to answer it. I have to, because the tapping has started again. 3 distinct taps, then silence, and Rex is growling at the door. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I am 32 years old. This happened in September 2024. I never should have gone camping in Blood Mountain Wilderness alone. That's what everyone told me afterward, as if the tragedy could have been prevented by simple companionship. What they don't understand is that sometimes the wilderness calls to you in a voice that drowns out all reason. For me, that call came after my divorce from Emily. 3 bitter years of marriage ending with empty bank accounts and hollowed-out promises. You need time to clear your head, my therapist had suggested during our final session. Reconnect with yourself. I chose Blood Mountain in northern Georgia because the name itself felt appropriate. The Appalachian Trail runs through it, and I'd hiked sections before, but never solo and never for more than a day. This time I planned to spend a full week traversing the wilderness area, camping at different spots each night. The isolation was precisely what I craved. No cell service, no emails, no pitying looks from friends who'd chosen sides after the divorce. What I discovered there, in those ancient woods, was that isolation is never truly complete. Something always watches, waits, follows. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I hiked from Byron Herbert Reese Memorial to the Blood Mountain summit and then northwest toward Slaughter Creek. The late September weather was perfect, crisp mornings giving way to comfortable afternoons beneath a canopy that had just begun its seasonal transformation. I filled my journal with observations about woodland creatures and geological formations, snapped photographs of sweeping vistas, and slept dreamlessly beneath star-strewn skies. On the third day, I noticed the first abnormality: my compass. I'd been following a lesser-used trail that branched off toward Gerard Gap when the needle began to spin. Slowly at first, then faster, whirling like a carnival ride before stopping abruptly, pointing southwest instead of north. I tapped the casing, shook it, but the needle remained fixed in its incorrect position. "Weird magnetic deposits," I muttered, tucking the compass away and relying instead on my phone's GPS. But within an hour, my fully charged phone was dead. Not low battery, completely dead. No amount of button pressing or cable connecting would revive it. Still, I wasn't concerned. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. I could navigate by the sun and terrain features. I took a bearing from a distinctive ridgeline and pressed on, humming softly to myself. That night I made camp near a small stream flowing down from Leveland Mountain. As darkness fell, I noticed the unusual silence. No chirping insects, no rustling nocturnal creatures. Just the soft gurgle of water over stones and the occasional whisper of wind through pine needles. I told myself this was normal, that wildlife patterns changed with seasons and weather conditions. But a primitive part of my brain recognized the wrongness of it, raising the fine hairs on my neck. I built a fire larger than necessary, feeding it until flames leaped high enough to cast my shadow against nearby trees. Something about those shadows seemed off, elongated beyond what physics should allow, shifting independently of my movements. Once, I could have sworn my shadow raised an arm while both of mine remained firmly at my sides. Sleep came reluctantly that night, my body curled tight within my sleeping bag despite the fire's warmth. Dreams, when they finally claimed me, were fragmented scenes of pursuit, something chasing me through endless trees, always just behind, always gaining. I awoke to fog so thick I could barely see 3 feet ahead. The fire had died to cold ash, and moisture beaded everything: my tent, my pack, my skin. The air felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. I packed quickly, eager to be moving, to shake off the lingering unease from my dreams. The trail should have descended toward Neil Gap. Instead, after an hour of careful hiking, I found myself climbing. The fog persisted, clinging to the landscape like a shroud, revealing only ghostly tree trunks and occasional rock formations that seemed to shift position when viewed from different angles. By midday, I was lost. Not the temporary disorientation that comes from missing a trail marker, but the profound, stomach-dropping certainty that nothing around me matched my maps or memory. The terrain itself seemed wrong, too steep in places that should be gentle, streams flowing in impossible directions, ancient trees growing where no trees should be. I paused in a small clearing to reorient myself, spreading my useless map across a flat boulder. That's when I noticed the carvings, crude symbols etched into the stone's surface, partially obscured by lichen, spirals, stick figures, and what appeared to be an eye with a vertical pupil. They looked old, weathered by countless seasons, yet something about them seemed freshly disturbed, as if someone had traced the grooves recently. As I studied them, cold dread pooled in my stomach. These weren't Cherokee markings or modern trailblazes. They reminded me of something I'd seen in an anthropology textbook, symbols associated with Appalachian folk magic, with darkness and binding. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled, heart hammering, to find a man standing at the clearing's edge. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in faded flannel and work pants that hung loosely on his frame. His face, partially hidden beneath an unkempt beard, was weathered to leather, yet his eyes were surprisingly bright, pale blue, almost luminous in the dim forest light. "You're a ways off the main trail," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Name's Elias Blackwood." "Daniel," I replied, relief washing through me despite some lingering wariness. "I got turned around in this fog. My compass and phone both died." He nodded as if this explained everything. "Happens up here sometimes. Electronic things don't take to these woods." "Do you live nearby?" I asked, noting his lack of hiking gear. "Yep, got a cabin about 2 miles east. Been here all my life." He gestured toward my pack. "You look like you could use a hot meal and some directions." Every safety rule about backcountry hiking screamed against following a stranger in unfamiliar territory. But exhaustion and hunger clouded my judgment, and something about Elias seemed genuine, a weathered relic of mountain life, harmless in his isolation. "That would be great," I heard myself say. "I appreciate it." He turned without another word, moving with surprising agility between trees and over uneven ground. I followed, struggling to match his pace while noting landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, an unusual rock formation, a small waterfall cascading over moss-covered stones. If necessary, I could find my way back. But back to where? I was already lost. The fog thinned as we descended into a narrow valley, revealing a small cabin nestled against a steep hillside. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and stacked firewood lined the eastern wall. A covered porch wrapped around the structure, adorned with hanging bundles of dried plants and what looked unsettlingly like animal bones. "Home sweet home," Elias said, mounting the steps. "Been in my family 7 generations." The cabin's interior was a single large room divided by function. A kitchen area with wood-burning stove, a living space centered around a stone fireplace, and a curtained-off section I presumed was for sleeping. Every surface was cluttered with items: jars filled with unidentifiable substances, books with cracked leather spines, yellowed photographs in tarnished frames, and more bundles of dried plants hanging from ceiling beams. The air smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and something else. Something metallic and organic that raised primal warnings in my mind. "A sit." Elias gestured toward a rough-hewn table. "I'll fix us something." I obeyed, setting my pack beside me while surreptitiously checking that my hunting knife remained accessible in its side pocket. Elias busied himself at the stove, his back to me as he worked. "Been seeing much wildlife?" he asked casually. "Less than I expected," I admitted. "Everything's been strangely quiet." He nodded without turning. "Animals know things we've forgotten. They sense when something ain't right." "What do you mean?" "These mountains hold secrets." He ladled something from a perpetually simmering pot into wooden bowls. "Hold secrets? Hungry ones." He placed a bowl before me, some kind of stew, thick with chunks of meat and root vegetables. Steam carried that same peculiar smell I'd noticed earlier, stronger now. "What kind of meat is this?" I asked, unable to identify it by sight. Elias's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Local game. Eat up. You'll need your strength." Hunger overrode caution, and I took a tentative spoonful. The flavor was rich, gamey, with unfamiliar spices that numbed my tongue slightly. Not unpleasant, but deeply strange, as if my body recognized something my conscious mind couldn't identify. As we ate, Elias spoke of the mountains, their history, their dangers. He told me about early settlers who'd disappeared, about Cherokee legends warning against certain valleys and caves, about his own family's long tradition of keeping watch. "Watching for what?" I asked, finding myself oddly drowsy despite the food's warmth and sustenance. He studied me for a long moment. For those who get called too deep into the woods. The room seemed to dim, edges blurring. My limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. Through increasingly foggy consciousness, I watched Elias rise from his chair, moving with that same uncanny grace. "Rest now," he said, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Night's coming." Darkness claimed me. I awoke to absolute blackness. Not the ambient darkness of a forest night penetrated by moonlight, but complete, suffocating absence of light. For several panicked heartbeats, I feared blindness until my eyes gradually adjusted to reveal faint outlines. Rough walls, a low ceiling, a dirt floor beneath me. Not Elias's cabin, a cave or cellar of some kind. I sat up, head pounding with each pulse of blood, mouth cotton dry. My pack was gone, along with my boots and outer clothing, leaving me in t-shirt and jeans. The air was cold, damp, and carried that same metallic organic smell from before, stronger here. "Hello?" My voice emerged as a croak, swallowed immediately by the oppressive darkness. No answer came. I felt around my immediate surroundings, rough stone floor transitioning to dirt, a wall of fitted rocks behind me, empty space ahead. Slowly, painfully, I crawled forward until my hand touched something soft, yielding, fabric, clothing, a person. I recoiled with a strangled cry, heart hammering as I fumbled for my phone before remembering it was dead, gone with my pack. No light, no way to see what or who lay before me. Drawing a shuddering breath, I reached out again, forcing myself to explore methodically. A hiking boot, denim jeans, a cold, rigid arm ending in stiff fingers, a corpse. Bile rose in my throat as my trembling hands continued their grotesque investigation. Male, based on size and clothing. No obvious injuries my fingers could detect, but the unnatural stillness and cold told me he'd been dead for days, not hours. My searching fingers found something else. A small flashlight clipped to the dead man's belt. Miraculously, it worked, casting a weak yellow beam that confirmed my worst fears. The body belonged to a hiker in his late 20s, dark-haired and bearded. His sightless eyes stared upward, face frozen in an expression of profound terror. No visible wounds marred his body, yet something was terribly wrong with his appearance. His skin seemed deflated somehow, as if something essential had been drained from beneath it. The flashlight's beam revealed more horrors. I wasn't in a natural cave, but a roughly circular chamber with walls of fitted stone, an ancient root cellar or storage room, perhaps 20 feet across. My dead companion wasn't alone. 3 more bodies lay in various stages of decomposition around the chamber's perimeter, all displaying that same desiccated appearance. And on the walls, etched into the stone, were symbols matching those I'd seen on the boulder in the clearing. The weak light caught something else. A wooden door set into the far wall secured with a simple metal latch. Hope surged as I scrambled toward it, only to crash into despair when I found it locked from the outside. I was trapped in a charnel house, drugged and imprisoned by a mountain man for purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. Hours passed in that lightless tomb as I alternated between frantic searches for escape and periods of numb, hopeless waiting. The flashlight, my only comfort, began to dim. I rationed its use, preserving the battery while my mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. Who was Elias Blackwood? A serial killer preying on isolated hikers? Part of some backwoods cult? The questions brought no answers, only escalating fear. When the door finally creaked open, I was huddled against the far wall, flashlight clutched like a talisman. Firelight spilled into the chamber, silhouetting Elias's tall form in the doorway. Behind him stood 3 more figures, similarly gaunt, similarly dressed in anachronistic mountain attire. "Brought my brothers to meet you, Daniel," Elias said conversationally, as if we were at a social gathering. "Josiah, Ezekiel, and Abraham." The three men nodded in unison but remained silent, their pale eyes reflecting firelight like animals caught in headlights. "Why am I here?" I demanded, voice breaking. "What do you want?" "Want?" Elias sounded genuinely puzzled. "Ain't about want. It's about need, about keeping balance." "What balance? Those people—" I gestured toward the corpses. "You murdered them." "Not murder," the one called Ezekiel spoke, his voice eerily similar to Elias's gravelly tone. "Sacrifice." "The mountain gets hungry," Abraham added. "Been hungry since the first Blackwood settled here." "Every season needs feeding," Josiah concluded, "or it comes for us instead." Elias stepped fully into the chamber, torch held high. "Our ancestors made a pact with what lives beneath Blood Mountain. We uphold it, same as they did." "What lives beneath?" I repeated numbly. "Older than Cherokee. Older than anything with a name." Elias crouched before me, his weathered face almost kind in the flickering light. "It sleeps most times, but when it wakes, it hungers." "For what?" "Life essence, soul stuff." His pale eyes searched mine. "We feed it strangers, it leaves locals be. Simple arrangement." My mind reeled with the insanity of his words. These weren't serial killers, but delusional backwoods cultists trapped in centuries-old superstition, performing human sacrifices to appease some imagined mountain deity. Yet those bodies, drained without visible wounds. "You're insane," I whispered. "Maybe so," Elias conceded with a small shrug. "Don't change what needs doing." The four brothers moved with practiced coordination, surrounding me before I could react. Strong hands seized my arms, dragged me upright. I fought wildly, landing a solid kick to Abraham's knee that drew a pained grunt but didn't loosen his grip. They hauled me from the chamber into a narrow tunnel braced with ancient timbers, air growing colder as we descended. My struggles weakened as claustrophobia clawed at my consciousness. The low ceiling, the pressing darkness beyond their torchlight, the knowledge of countless tons of mountain rock overhead. "Stop fighting," Elias advised calmly. "Makes it harder than it needs to be." "Please," I gasped, switching tactics. "I have family, people who'll look for me." "They won't find you," Josiah said with certainty. "Mountain keeps its own." The tunnel widened into another chamber, this one natural rather than man-made, a limestone cavern with a high ceiling disappearing into darkness. Stalactites hung like stone daggers above a raised stone platform at the center. More symbols covered the walls, floor, and platform itself, carved deep and painted with something dark and flaking. Old blood. "Here's where it happens," Elias explained almost proudly. "Where we make the offering." They forced me onto the platform, binding my wrists and ankles with coarse rope to iron rings embedded in the stone. The position left me spread-eagled, vulnerable, staring up at darkness. "What happens now?" I asked, voice barely audible. "Now we call it," Ezekiel said, producing a crude drum from somewhere in the shadows. "And it comes," Abraham added, lighting bundles of herbs that filled the chamber with acrid smoke. "And it feeds," Josiah concluded, unsheathing a knife with a bone handle. The brothers began a rhythmic chant in a language I couldn't identify. Not Cherokee, not English, something guttural and archaic that seemed to resonate within the cave itself. Ezekiel's drum established a heartbeat tempo, slow and deliberate. The smoke thickened, stinging my eyes and throat, inducing dizziness that made the stalactites above seem to writhe like living things. I strained against my bonds until skin tore and blood slicked the ropes, but the ancient restraints held firm. Panic clawed through me as the chanting intensified, as the air grew colder still, as something changed in the quality of darkness above. Something was moving there, in the cavern's heights. Something vast. "Please," I sobbed, pride long abandoned. "Don't do this." Elias paused in his chanting to regard me with something like compassion. "Too late now, it's already coming." A sound penetrated the chamber then, not from the brothers or their drum, but from above. A slow, wet, sliding noise, like something massive shifting through confined space. The stalactites continued their impossible movement, and with dawning horror, I realized they weren't formations at all, but appendages. Teeth, or claws, or tentacles descending from some greater mass concealed in darkness. The brothers, chanting, reached fever pitch as the first of those appendages drifted downward, hovering just above my chest. It was blackness given physical form, absorbing rather than reflecting the torchlight. At its tip was an opening ringed with smaller, hook-like protrusions. "Old as the mountains," Elias whispered reverently, "hungry as death." The appendage descended the final inches to touch my chest directly over my heart. No pain came, only profound cold that spread rapidly through my body. I tried to scream but found no air in my lungs. The cold reached deeper, beyond flesh, beyond bone, touching something essential at my core. It was feeding on my soul. Through dimming consciousness, I became aware of commotion, shouting, the crash of bodies colliding, firelight swinging wildly. One of the brothers, Josiah, I thought, suddenly pitched forward across my bound form, blood fountaining from a wound in his throat. The appendage retracted instantly, disappearing into the darkness above with that same wet, sliding sound. More shouts, more struggling, a familiar voice calling my name, then a face above mine, bearded, wild-eyed, but wonderfully, beautifully human. "Hang on, buddy," the man said, sawing at my restraints with a hunting knife. "Almost got you." I recognized him from photographs I'd studied before my trip. Connor Wainwright, a park ranger assigned to Blood Mountain Wilderness. He'd been mentioned in articles about increased disappearances in the area over recent years. "How?" I managed, my voice a thread. "Been tracking these psychos for months," Connor grunted, freeing my right arm. "Never could find their hideout until I followed him taking you." My left arm came free, then my legs. Connor helped me sit upright, supporting me when vertigo threatened to topple me backward. "There were 4, I warned, seeing only the dead Josiah nearby. "Others ran deeper in when I shot this one," Connor confirmed, checking my pulse with professional efficiency. "Can you walk? We need to move, now." I nodded, though I wasn't certain my legs would support me. The cold lingered in my chest, a frozen core where the appendage had touched me. Connor half carried me back through the tunnel, pausing at junctions to ensure our path. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, running footsteps, angry voices echoing through stone passages, and something else, that wet, sliding noise, no longer above but within the tunnels themselves. "Something's in here," I gasped as Connor navigated another junction. "Something they worship?" "Save your strength," he cut me off. "Almost out." Torchlight appeared ahead. Not the handheld flames the brothers carried, but daylight. Blessed daylight filtering through an opening partially concealed by vegetation. Connor increased our pace, practically dragging me the final yards. We emerged onto a steep hillside I didn't recognize, the late afternoon sun momentarily blinding after hours in darkness. My relief was short-lived as shouts erupted behind us, Elias and his remaining brothers emerging from the hidden entrance. "Keep moving," Connor urged, helping me scramble down the slope toward a Forest Service road where his truck waited. "Don't look back." But I did look back, just once, and saw not only the pursuing brothers but something moving among the trees behind them. Something that didn't disturb branches or leaves yet displaced space itself, a rippling void that flowed like liquid shadow across the mountainside. Connor bundled me into his truck and roared down the gravel road, tires spitting stones. Through the rear window, I watched the 3 Blackwood brothers reach the roadside and stop, making no attempt to follow further. Their domain ended at the wilderness boundary, their power confined to the mountain and its secrets. The thing that had fed on me, however, that ancient, hungry presence, showed no such limitation. All through our desperate drive to Ranger headquarters, I felt it following, flowing through forest and across ridge lines, keeping pace with mechanical persistence. At headquarters, Connor radioed for medical assistance and police backup while I huddled beneath blankets, the unnatural cold still radiating from my chest. I told my story with numb detachment, watched skepticism battle with concern on the faces of responding officers. They humored me, promised to investigate the cave system and search for more victims. I later learned they found nothing, no cave entrance, no chambers, no bodies. The Blackwood brothers themselves seemed to vanish, their supposed cabin non-existent according to property records. Only Connor's testimony about rescuing me from mountain men prevented authorities from dismissing my account entirely. Medical examinations found no physical explanation for my symptoms: the persistent cold, the nightmares, the feeling of incompleteness that haunted me long after leaving Georgia. Doctors diagnosed PTSD, prescribed therapy and medication that dulled the edges but couldn't touch the frozen core where something had fed. I returned to civilization, to a life that no longer fit quite right. Friends commented on changes they couldn't articulate, a flatness to my emotions, a distance in my gaze. Emily visited once, concern temporarily outweighing bitterness, but left disturbed by what she called the emptiness behind my eyes. 3 months after Blood Mountain, Connor Wainwright disappeared while investigating another missing hiker report. Search parties found only his abandoned vehicle and a journal documenting his obsession with what he'd come to call the Hollow Men of Blood Mountain. I recognized his handwriting from the note he left on my hospital bedside. It doesn't stop hunting once it's tasted you. I dream of caves now, of darkness with substance and hunger. Sometimes I wake to find moisture on my ceiling, impossible condensation forming patterns that resemble the symbols carved in stone beneath the mountain. More disturbingly, I've caught glimpses of my reflection behaving independently, movements slightly out of sync with my own. I know what this means. The thing beneath Blood Mountain wasn't confined to those ancient tunnels. It followed me home, patient and immortal, waiting to finish what it started. So I've returned to Georgia with purpose and preparation. Not to Blood Mountain, I'm not that foolish, but to archives and university collections where Cherokee legends and settler accounts might hold forgotten knowledge. I seek methods of binding, of banishing, protection against ancient appetites. And I watch for Blackwoods, for pale eyes and weathered faces in crowds, for those who might recognize what's happening to me and know how to end it. Because the cold spreads daily, the emptiness growing. Soon there will be nothing left of Daniel Hayes but a hollow vessel walking through life's motions, another offering to whatever ancient darkness dwells beneath Blood Mountain. And if you're reading this, if you're planning your own backcountry adventure in Georgia's mountains, reconsider. Some wilderness areas are meant to remain wild, some ancient beings left undisturbed. Not all who wander are lost, but some who become lost are never truly found again. Like me.